Chapter 23 of Beyond These Voices. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 23. Veera told her husband that she did not mind solitude, yet it was a face of ashen whiteness that he left behind when he shut the door of her dressing-room after his hurried and cheerful goodbye on the first day of the Goodwood meeting. He was driving his 60-horsepower Daimler to Goodwood, steering for himself, while the chauffeur sat behind ready for road repairs, or to give a hand in carrying a corpse to the nearest hospital. The speed limit was naturally disregarded, as the thing that Claude wanted was excitement, the hazards of the road as they sped past hamlet and farm, followed by the long white dust cloud that flashed across the landscape like the fiery tail of a comet, while startled villagers gasped and wondered if a car had passed. Peril was the zest that made the journey worth doing, to feel that his hand upon the wheel held life at his disposal, and that any awkward turn in the road might bring him sudden death. He was gone, and Veera was alone in the gloomy London house, so much more gloomy than the vast halls and galleries of the Roman villa, where colossal windows let in vast spaces of blue sky. Here the heavily draped sashes admitted only a slit of sunshine, tempered by London smoke. She was alone, but she told herself that solitude did not matter. It was not solitude that weighed upon her spirits as she roamed from room to room in the emptiness and silence. It was the sense of not being alone that weighed upon her. It was the consciousness of a silent presence, the invisible third who had come between her and her husband of late, who had come back into her life, in the noontide of her love, while passion reigned supreme, and the man she loved filled her world. The shadow had been lifted from her path. She had seen all old things dimly, dazzled by the glory of her life's sun. She had remembered nothing, except her childish bliss with the boy who was to be her fate. Her life began and ended in her husband, as it had begun and ended in Claude Rutherford when he was only her friend and companion, the light-hearted companion whose presence meant happiness. In the first 2 years of her second marriage she had been completely absorbed in that transcendent love, and in the ceaseless round of pleasure and excitements that her husband contrived for her, filling her days and nights with emotional moments, with little social triumphs and trivial ambitions. Satiety came in an hour, or it may be that it came so slowly and so gradually that there was an hour when Veera awoke to the consciousness that she was tired of everything, that the earth with all its changing loveliness, its surprises of mountain and lake, wood and river, was but a sterile promontory, and the blue vault above Como only a pestilent congregation of vapors. The suddenness of the revelation was startling, but not the uncommon malady that afflicted the Prince of Denmark had been eating her heart for a long time, before she was aware of its hold upon her. And with the coming of satiety, the distaste for amusement, the distrust of love, came the shadow. Memory that had been lulled asleep by the magic philtre of passion, awakened and was alive again. She roamed the great, silent house, haunting with a morbid preference those rooms that were particularly associated with the dead man, that range of spacious rooms on the ground floor where nothing had been altered since Mario Provana lived in them, his library, and the severe, official-looking sitting-room adjoining, where he was often closeted with his partners and allies, his head clerks and managers, his business visitors from Vienna, Rome, Berlin, Madrid, New York. When the drawing room had been transformed by a gayer style of decoration, more in harmony with Vera's frivolous entertainments, Claude had been urgent that these ground floor rooms should be refurnished, and every trace of their severe, business-like aspect done away with, and even certain priceless old masters that Provana had been proud of dispatched with ruthless haste to Christie's sale room. But to his astonishment, Vera had told him that nothing was to be changed in the rooms her husband had occupied, that all things touched or valued by him were to be sacred. For this reason, while approving Claude's plan of color for the walls and draperies and carpets in the drawing rooms, she had insisted upon retaining the Italian cabinets of ebony and ivory, and the Florentine mosaic tables, the things that had been collected all over Italy a century ago, in the beginning of the Provana riches. And now, solitary and dejected, she moved restlessly from room to room, sometimes standing before one of the bookcases in the library, and looking along the titles of books that she had learnt to love in those far-off days before she had been launched by the Disbrowes, a frail cockle-shell, spinning round and round in the society whirlpool, while she and her husband were still unfashionable enough to sit together in the autumn twilight, or to spend tete-a-tete evenings in this solemn-looking room. His mind was with her there to-day, in the July sunshine, as it had been in those evenings of past, while he was a living man. He remembered speech was in her ears to-day, grave and earnest, telling her the things she loved to hear, widening her view of life, opening the gate to new knowledge, the knowledge of authors she had never heard of, the story of heroes and statesmen, philosophers and poets, whose names had been only names till he made them living people, people to be admired and loved. He had taught her to comprehend and love Dante, to appreciate the verse of Carducci, the prose of Manzoni. He had taught her to revere Cavour, to adore Saint Francis of Assisi, to weep for Savonarola and Giordano Bruno. He had made Italy a land of genius and valor, a land alive from the Alps to the Adriatic with heroic memories. He had made her know and love the history of his country, almost as he himself loved it. And now his spirit filled the room in which the man had lived. His shadow had come into the house that had been his, and had taken possession of the place and of the atmosphere. Whatever might still remain of the undisciplined love, the passion of unreasoning youth that she had given to her second husband, she could never again release herself from that first marriage tie. It was the bond of death. She went into the dining room when luncheon was announced, carrying a volume of Browning, and made some pretense of eating, with the book open by the side of her plate. a proceeding upon which the butler expatiated somewhat severely that afternoon as he lingered over tea in the housekeeper's comfortable parlor. "I don't know what's come over the missus," he said, as he took an unwelcome stranger out of his second cup, and parenthetically, "This tea isn't what it was, Mrs. Manby. She don't eat enough for a tomtit, let alone a sparrow, and she's falling back into that dreamy way she was in when Provana was in America, and for a long time before that, as you may remember, that time when it was always not at home to Mr. Rutherford." "She was trying to break with him," said Mrs. Manby. "I give her credit for that." "So you may. But that kind of trying was never known to answer, when once they've begun to carry on," remarked Mr. Sedgewick. "I've watched too many cases not to know the inevitability of them," he added, having picked up the modern jargon more or less incorrectly. The long day wore on to the melancholy twilight, and Vera was dreading the appearance of her maid to remind her that it was time to dress for her solitary dinner. She had talked lightly of having Lady Susan at her disposal, but she knew that her friend was at the very hour contributing to the vivacity of one of the smartest of the Goodwood house parties, and would be so engaged till the end of the week. She had thought, in her weariness of the mill round, that solitude would be better than the society that had long become distasteful, but she found that, in the melancholy hour between dog and wolf, the shadows in a London house were full of fear, vague and shapeless fear, an oppression that had neither form nor name, and that was infinitely worse than any materialization. She was standing by the window in her morning room, looking down into the grey emptiness of the wide carriage way, when no carriages were passing, and on pavements where unfashionable pedestrians were moving quickly through a drizzling rain, when a servant announced Father Hammond. "Can you forgive me for calling at such an unorthodox time? I happened to be passing your door, as I have called several times at the right hour and not found you. I thought I would try the wrong hour." "No hour can be wrong that brings you," said she in a low voice, as she gave him her hand, and the words sounded more sincere than such speeches usually are. "I am glad to hear you say as much, as I believe you. In the whirlpool of frivolity a few serious moments may have the charm of contrast." "I have done with the whirlpool." "Tired of it? After only 3 years? There are some of my flock who have been going round in the same witches' dance for a quarter of a century, and are still in the crowd on the Brocken." "I can but think you have made the pace too fast since your second marriage, or perhaps it is your husband who has made the pace." "You must not think that. We both like the same things. We are companions now as we were when I was a child at Disbrowe Park, and when we were so happy together." Her eyes filled with tears. Oh, how far away that time of innocent gladness seemed, as she looked back. What an abyss yawned between then and now. "I have distressed you," the priest said gently, taking her hand. "No, no, but it is always painful to look back." Father Hammond drew her towards the sofa by the open window and seated himself at her side. Let us have a really friendly talk now. I have been so lucky as to find you alone," he said. "I am glad, very glad, that you are tired of the whirlpool, for to be tired of but a bad kind of life is the beginning of a better kind of life. You know what I think of modern society, especially in the feminine aspect, and how I have grieved over the women who were made for better things than the witches' dance. We have talked of these things in your first husband's lifetime, but then I thought you were taking your frivolous pleasures with a careless indifference that showed your heart was not engaged in them, and that you had a mind for higher things. Even your dabbling with Mr. Symonds's quasi-supernatural philosophy was a sign of superiority. His disciples are not the basest or most empty-headed among worldlings, though they keep touch with the world. In those days you know I had hopes of you, but since you have been Claude Rutherford's wife I have seen you given up to an insatiate love of pleasure, a headlong pursuit of every new thing. The more extravagant and the more dangerous, the more hotly pursued by you and your husband, so that it has become a byword. If the thing is to cost a fortune, and to risk a life, the Rutherfords will be in it. Claude is impetuous, easily caught by a novelty," she said deprecatingly, with lowered eyelids. "He was not always so impetuous, rather a loiterer, indifferent to all strenuous pleasures, delighting in all that is best in literature, and worshipping all that is best in art, though too idle to achieve excellence even in the art he loved. But since his marriage, and forgive me if I say since his command of your wealth, he has changed and degenerated." "You are not complimentary to his wife," Vera said, with a faint laugh. "I am too much in earnest to be polite. But it is not your influence that has done harm. It is your money. That fatal gold which has changed the whole aspect of society within the last 30 years, a change that will continue from bad to worse as long as diamond mines and gold mines are productive, and the inheritors of great names can smile at the vulgarity of millionaires who do them well, and will give the open hand of friendship a host who to-morrow may be branded as a thief. What does it matter, if the thief has bought Lord Somebody's estate, and shooting that is among the best in England?" "Well, it's all done with now, as far as I'm concerned," Vera said wearily. "I used to go everywhere Claude liked to go. People laughed at us for being inseparable, but I am sick to death of it all. And now he must go to the fine houses alone. No doubt he will be all the more welcome." "Perhaps. But I did not come to talk of trivialities or to echo hackneyed diatribes against a state of things so corrupt and evil that its vices have become the staple of every preacher's discourses, cleric or layman. I want to talk about you and your husband, not about the world you live in. Since you have done with the whirlpool, there is nothing to keep you from better influences. Will you let mine be the hand to lead you along the passive way of light and love, the way that leads to pardon and peace?" Vera turned from him, trying to hide her agitation, but the feelings he had awakened were too strong, and she let her head fall upon the arm of the sofa, and gave herself up to a passion of tears. "Pardon?" she gasped, amidst her sobs. "You know I need pardon." We all need pity and pardon. No man's life is spotless, and the life you and Claude have been living is a life of sin, aimless, sensual, godless. I have had a wide experience of men. I have known the best and the worst, and I have seen the strange transmutations that may take place in a man, under certain influences. How the sinner may become a saint, and the saint fall into an abyss of sin. But I have never seen changes so sudden and so inexplicable as those I have seen in your husband, whom I have known, and I think I may say I have loved, from the time when he began to have a will and a mind. I hope you do not blame me for his having left the monastery and come back to the world." "How can I blame you when his mother was the active agent? She is a good woman, though a weak one, where her affections are engaged. She was perfectly frank with me. She told me how you had refused to use your influence to keep her son in the world, and she loved you because she thought it was his love for you that made him abandon his purpose. She rejoiced in his marriage, but I doubt if she has been any more edified than I have been in watching the life you and her son have been leading since then. No, I do not blame you for Claude's sudden breakdown, but I deeply deplore that he should have turned back, since I know that his resolution to have done with the world was a right one, astounding as it seemed to me when I first heard of it. I urged him against a step for which I thought him utterly unprepared. I did not believe in his vocation, but after consideration made me take a different view of his case. I knew that such a man would never have contemplated such a renunciation without so strong a reason that it was my duty to encourage him in the sacrifice of the world rather than to hold him back. I will say something more than this, Mrs. Rutherford. I will tell you that if it was to make his peace with God that your husband entered the Roman monastery, he lost all hope of peace when he left it, and he will never know rest for his heart and his conscience until he returns to the path that leads to the cloister." "Claude is happy enough," Vera answered lightly. "He has so many occupations and interests. He is not as tired of things as I am. But no doubt I shall have to go on giving parties now and then, on Claude's account. He is not tired of the maelstrom, and it would not please him for me to drop out altogether, and to be talked about as eccentric, or not quite right." She spoke with a weariness that moved the priest to pity, and then he spoke to her, as he had sometimes spoken in the past, words that were profoundly earnest, even eloquent. For what highly educated man, or even what uneducated man, can miss being eloquent when his faith is deeply rooted and sincere, and his feelings are strongly moved? He offered her the shelter of the church, the only armor of defense against the weariness and wickedness of life. He would have led her in the passive way of light and love. He offered her the only certain cure for that Weltschmerz of which her husband had complained when he wanted to end his life in a cloister. He had pleaded with her before to-day, had tried to win her, years ago, when the pleasures of life had still something of their first freshness. He had tried vainly then, and his efforts were as vain as now. She answered him coldly, almost mechanically. Yes, it was true that she was tired of everything, as Claude had been years before their marriage, as he would be again perhaps by and by. But the church could not help her. If she were to become a Roman Catholic, it would only be in order to escape from the world, to do as Claude had wished to do, and to make an end of life that had lost all savour. But until she was prepared to take the veil, she would remain as she was, a believer, but not in formulas, a believer in the afterlife and in the influencing minds, the putrid souls that had crossed the river. I see you prefer Mr. Simon's religion of the day before yesterday to take that of the saints and martyrs of 2,000 years ago, Cyprian Hammond said, in his coldest tones, as he rose to leave her. You are as dark a mystery as your husband is. God help you both, for I fear I cannot. The grey darkness of a wet summer night was in the room as Vera rose to ring the bell and switch on the lamps. The clear white light showed her face drawn and pale, but very calm. She held out both her hands to the priest. "Forgive me," she said. "The day may come when I shall ask you to open the convent door for me, but I am not ready yet." End of chapter 23. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 24 of Beyond These Voices. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 24. The Goodwood of that year was a brilliant meeting. The winners were the horses that all the smart people wanted to win. The weather, with the exception of that first rainy twilight, was perfect, and all the smart frocks and hats spread themselves and unfolded their beauty to the sun, like flowers in a garden by the Lake of Como. Among the owners of winning horses, Mr. Rutherford was conspicuous. "You rich people are always lucky," said his friends. "You never buy duffers, and you can afford to pay for talent. I don't suppose you make much by your luck, but you have the glory of it." The house in which Claude Rutherford was staying was one of the smartest houses between Goodwood and Brighton, a house where there were always to be found clever men and handsome women, musical people and painting people, and even acting people, people who could sing and people who could talk, women who shone by the splendor of physical beauty, and women whose audacious wit made the delight of princes. It was a house in which cards were a secondary consideration, but where stakes were high and hours were late. Lady Waterbury, the hostess, expressed poignant disappointment at Vera's non-arrival. "My poor little wife is completely run down," Claude told her. "She was a rag this morning, and it would have been cruel to persuade her to come with me, though I hated leaving her in London at this dismal fag end of the season. I thought her pal Susan Amphlett would have spent most of the week with her, but I hear Lady Susie is at the Saxe and Mundellins." "Do you suppose Susie would miss a good wood? No, not for friendship," exclaimed Sir Joseph, the jovial host, one of the last of the private bankers of London, coming of a family so long established in wealth that he could look down upon new money. "Well, there is one of our beauties ruled out. I don't know what we should do if we hadn't secured Mrs. Bellenden." "It was just as well to ask her this year," said his wife, with pinched lips, "though it was Sir Joseph's idea, not mine. I doubt if the best people will care about meeting her next season." "What has Mrs. Bellenden done to risk her future status?" Claude asked, and then, with his cynical smile, "Certainly she has committed the unforgivable sin of being the handsomest woman in London, which is quite enough to set all the other women against her." "It isn't her beauty that is the crime, but the use she makes of it. She has made more than one wife I know unhappy." "And yet you ask her to your house?" "Sir Joseph invites her. I only write the letter. So far she is just possible, but if I have any knowledge of character she will be quite impossible before long." "Let us make the most of her while her good days last," Claude said, laughing. "I should like to make a sketch of her before the brand of infamy is on her forehead. I have met her often, but my wife and she have not become allies, and if she is a snare for husbands and a peril for wives, it is rather lucky that Vera is not with me, for after a week in this delightful house they must have become pals." "I don't think proximity would make two such women friends," Lady Waterbury replied severely. "Again, if I am any judge of character, I should say that Vera and Mrs. Bellenden must be utterly unsympathetic." "My wife and I have a friendly compact," said Sir Joseph. "She may invite as many dowdy nieces and boring aunts as she likes, provided she asks no troublesome questions about the pretty women I want her to ask, and gives my nominees the best rooms." "Poor Aunt Sophia had a mere dog hole last Christmas," sighed Lady Waterbury. "Well, didn't she bring her dog?" "Poor darling, she never goes anywhere without Ponto, and of course she is a shade tiresome, and it is rather sweet of Joe to put up with her. Mrs. Bellenden may pass this time." "Did I hear somebody talking of me?" cried a crystal clear voice, and a woman as lovely as a midsummer dawn came with a swift step across the velvet turf towards the stone bench where Claude Rutherford and his host and hostess were seated. They had strolled into the Italian garden, after an abundant tea that had welcomed the first batch of guests, a meal at which Mrs. Bellenden had not appeared, preferring to take tea in her dressing room, while she watched her maid unpacked, and planned the week's campaign, the exact occasion for every frock and hat being thought out as carefully as the general in command of an army might consider the position of his forces. It was to be a visit of 5 days and evenings, and none of those expensive garments which the maid was shaking out and smoothing down with lightly caressing fingers was to be worn twice. All those forces had to be reviewed. Not a silk stocking, not a satin slipper must be reported missing. Silken petticoats that rustled aggressively, petticoats of muslin and lace that were as soft and noiseless as the snow whose whiteness they imitated, fans, jewels, everything must be put away in perfect condition, ready for a lady who sometimes left herself the shortest possible time for an elaborate toilet, and yet always contrived to appear with faultless finish. And this evening, as she came sailing across the garden, having changed her traveling clothes for a mauve muslin frock of such adorable simplicity that a curate's wife might have tried to copy it with the aid of a seamstress at 18 pence a day, she was a vision of beauty that any hostess might have been proud to number among her guests. She took her seat between Sir Joseph and his wife with careless grace, and held out her hand to Claude Rutherford without looking at him. "Lady Waterbury told me that you and Mrs. Rutherford were to be here," she said. "Is she resting after her journey?" "I am sorry to say she was not able to come with me." "Not ill, I hope?" "Not well enough for another Goodwood." "The race weeks come round so quickly as one gets old," sighed Mrs. Bellenden. "There seems hardly breathing time between the 2000 and the Leger. And while one is thinking about where to go for the winter, another year has begun and people are motoring to Newmarket for the Craven. The story of our lives from year to year is rather like a merry-go-round in a fair, but Mrs. Bellenden is too young to feel the rush." "Too young! I feel old, ages old as Rider Haggard's Ayesha when the spell was broken and the enchantress changed to a hag. But I am sadly disappointed at not meeting your wife," she went on, turning the wonderful eyes that people talked about with full power upon Claude. "I wanted to meet her in a nice friendly house. We have only met in crowds, and I believe she rather hates me." "How can you imagine anything so impossible?" "At any rate, she has given me no sign of liking, while I admire her intensely. Francis Symeon has talked to me about her. I have had so much of the world, the flesh, and the devil, that I want to know something of a lady whom he calls one of his beautiful souls." Upon this Mr. Rutherford had to say something polite, a something which implied that his wife would be charmed to see more of the lovely Mrs. Bellenden. People talked of Mrs. Bellenden's beauty to her face. It was one of the things which her own sex registered against her as a mark of bad style. She might be ever so handsome, other women admitted, but she was the worst possible style. A circus rider, promoted from the sawdust to a Mayfair drawing-room, could hardly have been worse. It was not long since this woman had burst upon the world of London, a revelation of physical loveliness. Then felt they, like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. There are planets and planets, as there are skies and skies. Assuredly neither Uranus nor Neptune created a greater ferment in the world of the wise than was made by Mrs. Beldenden's first season in the world of the foolish. The phrase "professional beauty" had been exploded, as vulgar and stale, but the type remained under new names. Mrs. Bellenden was simply the new beauty, invited everywhere, the star of every fashionable week-end party, every smart dance, or dinner, afternoon or evening, to hear divine music or to play ridiculous games, to be instructed about radium, or to lose money and temper at bridge. There could be no party really successful without Mrs. Belden. Men looked round the flower garden of picture hats with a disappointed air if her eyes did not flash lovely lighting from under one of them. Impetuous youths made a bee-line for her, and threaded the crowd with relentless elbows, calmly ignoring their loves of last season and the season before last. "Men are absolute idiots about that woman," the last seasons told each other. "No one has a look in where she is." Mrs. Belden was a young widow, a widow of 2 years' widowhood, the first of which it was whispered she had spent in a private lunatic asylum. "That's where she got her complexion," said Malice. "It was just as good as a year's rest in a nursing home." "And a strait waistcoat. That's where she got her figure," said Envy. She was now 26, a widow, living in a small house in a narrow street like the neck of a bottle, between Park Lane and South Audley Street, with an income of 2,000 a year, but popularly reputed to be spending at least 5,000. Her reputation in her first season had been unassailed, but she was rather taken upon trust, on the strength of the houses where she was met, than by reason of any exact knowledge that people had of her character and environment. Good-natured friends declared that she was thoroughbred, a creature with such exquisite hands and feet, and such a patrician turn of the swan-like throat, could hardly have come out of the gutter, and her husband had belonged to one of the oldest families in Wessex. So in that first season, except among her rivals in the beauty show, the general tone about her was approval. Then, in her second year as the lovely widow, things began to leak out, unpleasant things, as to the men she knew, and the money she spent, the hours she kept in the snug little house in Brown Street, the places at which she was seen in London and Paris, chiefly in Paris, where people pretended that she had a pied de terre, in the new quarter beyond St. Genevieve. People talked, but nothing was positively stated, except that she did curious things, and was beginning to be regarded somewhat shyly by prudish hostesses. She still went to a great many houses, smart houses and rich houses, but not quite the best houses, not the houses that can give a cachet and stop the mouth of slander. She gave little luncheons, little dinners, little suppers, in the little street out of Park Lane, and her lamp-lit drawing-room used to shine across the street in the small hours, as a token that there were talk and laughter and cards and music in the gay little room for tout le monde, or at least for her particular monde. She had a fine contralto voice, and sang French and Spanish ballads delightfully, could breathe such fire and passion into a song that the merest doggerel seemed inspired. But before this second season was over, there were a few people in London who had dreadful things to say about Mrs. Belden, and who said them with infinite cruelty, people for whose belongings, son or daughter, foolish youth or confiding young wife, this lovely widow had been a scourge. Looking at the radiant being people did not always remember, and some people did not know, the tragedy of her youth. She had been a good woman once, quite good, a model wife. She had married, before her 18th birthday, a husband she adored, a creature of intense vitality, made of fire and light, sense and not mind. Love with her had been a flame, unwise, unreasoning, exacting, love without thought, wildly adoring, wildly jealous. A word, a look given to another woman set her raging, and it was after one of the fierce quarrels that her jealous temper made only too frequent that her husband, handsome, gay, in flower of his youth, left her without the good-bye kiss for his last ride. He was brought back to her in the winter twilight, without a word of warning, killed at the last ditch in a point-to-point race, a race that was always remembered as the finest of many seasons, perhaps all the more vividly remembered because of that tragedy, just before the finish, when Jim Bellenden broke his neck. For some time after that dreadful night, Kate Bellenden was under restraint, and then, after nearly a year, in which none but near relations had seen her or had even known where she was, she came back to the world, not quite sane, and desperately wicked. That small brain of hers had not been large enough to hold a great grief. Satan had taken possession of a mind that had never been rightly balanced. "I have done with love," she told her âme damnée. She had always her shadow and confidant, upon whom she lavished gifts and indulgences. "I can never love anybody after him. But I like to be loved, and I like to make it hard for my lovers." And then, in still wickeder moods, she would say, "I like to steal a woman's husband, or to cut in between an engaged girl and the man she is to marry. I like to make another woman as desolate as I was after Jim was killed. But I can't make her quite as miserable. I am not death, but," with a little exulting laugh, "I am almost as bad." There were people, a mother, a sister, or a wife, here and there in the crowd we call society, who thought Mrs. Bellenden worse than death, people who knew the fortunes she had wasted, the houses she had ruined, the hearts she had broken, the careers she had blighted, and the souls that had been lost for her. End of chapter 24. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 25 of Beyond These Voices. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 25. Finding Claude Rutherford the most agreeable person in a house full of people, Mrs. Bellenden took possession of him on the first evening, not with any obvious devices or allurements, but coolly and calmly, just as she possessed herself of the most becoming armchair in the drawing room, with such an air of distinct appropriation that other women avoided it. "You seem to be the only amusing person here," she said, as he came to her side after dinner. "Isn't it strange that in so small a party there should be such a prodigious amount of dullness? Have you sampled all the people? There is Mr. Fitzallen over there talking to Lady Waterby.
a musical genius, who sets Shakespeare's sonnets and Heane's ballads deliciously, and sings them delightfully. You can't call them dull." "Not while he is singing. But I have heard all his songs." "Ask him to sing presently, and you will find he has brought a new batch. Then there is Eustace Lyon, the poet." Mrs. Bellenden smiled. "Do you know what they say of him?" she asked. "Who can remember half the things people say of a genius who lays himself out to be talked about? People are impertinent enough to say that he invented me." "That is to make him equal to Jove, nay, superior, for it was only incarnate wisdom, not surpassing beauty, that came from the brain of the Thunderer. I believe he did rave about me the year before last, when I set up house in London. Went about talking idiotically, called me a soothing gem, and 100 other ridiculous names." "But you don't mind? You bear no malice?" "No, he and I are always chums. I rather like being advertised." "Gratis?" "Of course. I treat him rather worse than my butler, but I admire his genius, and I let him sit on the carpet and read his poems to me, before they go to the printer." The poet joined them presently, stalking across the room, a tall, slim figure with a pale, lank face and long hair. The composer joined the group 5 minutes afterwards, and Mrs. Bellenden, having appropriated the only interesting man in the party, sank farther back in her deep chair, slowly fanning herself with her large white ostrich fan, and, as it were, withdrawing her beauty from circulation. Other women might affect a little fan, but Kate Bellenden knew the value of a large one, when there is a perfect arm with a hoop of Brazilian diamonds to be displayed. "I am only one of three," Claude said later in the week, when one of the men chaffed him about Mrs. Bellenden's favours. "She is a tête de linotte, and at her best in a quartet. One would soon come to the end of one's resources as an amusing person in a tête à tête." He told himself that this peerless beauty might soon become a bore, and he thought how much peerless loveliness there must have been in the royal preacher's palace at the very time he was writing Ecclesiastes. But all the same he found that Mrs. Bellenden's conversation, empty headed as it might be, gave a gusto to his days and nights during that Goodwood week. Their trivial talk was pleasant from its very foolishness. It was conversation without disturbing thought. There were no flashlights of memory to bring sudden sadness. A good deal of their talk was sheer nonsense, of no more value than the dialogue in a musical comedy. But it was a relief to talk nonsense, to laugh at bad puns, and to ridicule the serious side of life. Claude gave himself up to the mood of the moment, and was at his best, the irresponsible trifler, the mocker at solemn things, who had once been the desire of every hostess, the light, airy jester, to keep the table in a roar, the insidious flirt and flatterer, to amuse women after dinner. People told each other that Rutherford was quite in his old form. He had become horribly blasé and distrait of late, as if all the sparkle had gone out of him under the weight of his wife's gold. I don't believe a millionaire can be happy," said the poet. "Rutherford has been deteriorating ever since his marriage. He rushes about doing things racing, ballooning, flying, acting, hunting, shooting perpetual motion without gaiety. He was twice the man when he was loafing about the world on 1,500 a year." "He is one of those men whom marriage always spoils," replied the painter. "A chameleon soul that ought never to have worn fetters. To chain such a creature to a wife is as bad as caging a skylark. If he can't soar, he can't sing." "I take it he will soon be out of the cage. He has done 2 years of the married lover's business, and we shall see him presently as the emancipated husband." End of chapter 25. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 26, Part 1 of Beyond These Voices. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 26, Part 1. Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford were to winter in Rome, but there was the autumn still to be disposed of. Neither of them wanted Marienbad. They knew the place inside out and hated it, and after wasting half an hour at the breakfast table turning over a continental Bradshaw, they had only arrived more certainly at the conviction that they were tired of everywhere. The whole system of continental travelling was weariness and monotony. The race to Dover through the freshness of morning, the race across sunlit waves to Calais, the hurried luncheon in the station, and the 3 hours' run to Paris, the huge Gare du Nord, with its turmoil of blue blouses and loaded barrows, the long drive to the hotel, and the early start in the Rapide for the south, or the Engadine Express with the night journey through pine woods, and the rather weary awakening at Lucerne, and then on to Locarno and the Great Lake. It had been delicious while it was new, and while it was new for these two to be together, wedded and inseparable for evermore. But all the tracks that had been new were old now, and though they were lovers still, something had come between them that darkened love. Tyrol, Engadine, Courmayeur. No, said Vera, throwing Bradshaw aside. No, no, no. The hotels are all alike, and they make the scenery seem the same. If one could be adventurous, if one could stop at strange inns, where one need never hear an English voice, it would be better. But it is always the same hotel, the same rooms, and the same waiters, and the same food. A little better or a little worse. Generally worse, assented Claude. I've had a letter from Aunt Mildred this morning. She wants us to spend August at Disbrowe. Would you like it? He asked. Like it? She echoed, with her eyes clouding and a catch in her voice, and then she started up from her seat and came to her husband and put her hand upon his shoulder. I think we've been getting rather modern of late, Claude, she said in a low voice, rather semi-detached. Disbrowe would bring us nearer together again. We should remember the old days. Disbrowe, by all means, then, he answered gaily. We must never drift apart, Claude, she went on earnestly, with something of tragedy in her voice, which trembled a little as she crept closer to him. Remember, we have nothing but our love, nothing else between us and despair. Don't be tragic, Vera. he said quickly. "Disbrow by all means. Let us play at being boy and girl again. Let us do daring things on Oakhampton's twopenny halfpenny yacht, and ride horses that other people are afraid to handle. Let us put fire into the embers of the past. I suppose your aunt will have a few amusing people. It won't be the vicar and his wife and sister-in-law every night, and the curate at luncheon every other day." "She will have all sorts and conditions, but that doesn't matter. I want to be with you in the place where we were so happy." "You want to fall in love with me again? Well, it was time," he said half gaily and half sadly, but with always the air of a man who means to take life easily. August was August that year, and Disbrow was at its best. The great red cliffs, the azure and emerald sea, had the colour and the glory that had made North Devon fairyland for the child Veera in her one blissful summer. Other children, as they grew up, had a succession of delicious summers to look back upon, and could make comparisons, and wonder which was happiest. But Veera had only one season of surpassing joy to remember. She remembered it now, and contrived to draw a thick curtain over all other memories. Aunt Mildred was full of compliments. "This air evidently suits you, child," she said, when her niece had been with her a week. "You look 10 years younger than when I saw you last in London." These two, who had begun to be tired of each other, were lovers again, and even memory was kind. Even memory, the slow torture of thoughtful minds. They recalled the joys of 15 years ago, and the joys of today were almost the same. Instead of the 13 two-barb, there were half a dozen hunters, thoroughbreds of fine quality, the disappointments of Claude's racing stud. Instead of the dinghy, there was Oakhampton's 40-ton cutter, a rakish craft that had begun life at Cowes, another disappointment. There was the sea, and there was the moorland, and there were the patches of wood on the skirts of the park that had seemed boundless forests to Veera in her 12th year. Her 12th year! She remembered Claude's affected contempt for her youth. "Why, you are only a dozen, and not a round dozen, only 11 and a half. No wonder your cousins in the schoolroom look down upon you. If there were still a nursery, you would be there, sitting on a high chair at tea, your cheeks smeared with jam, and a bib tied under your chin." She remembered all his foolish speeches now, and what serious insults they had seemed to her, or to the child that she had once been, that innocent child whose identity with herself was so hard to believe. They were happy again. They were lovers again. Here they could say to each other, "Do you remember?" Here memory was a gentle nymph, and not an avenging fury. For Veera, who had hunted with her husband every year since their marriage, a season at Grantham, a season in the Shires, and 2 winters in the Campagna, it might seem a small thing to ride with Claude and a handful of squireens and farmers rattling up the cubs in the woods. Yet she found it pleasant to rise before the dawn and creep through the silent house and out into the crisp morning air, and to spring onto a horse that seemed to skim the ground in an ecstasy of motion. Flying could hardly be better than to sit on this light, leaping creature and see the dewy wood rush by, and the startled rabbits flash across the path, or to be lifted into the air as the thoroughbred stood on end at the whir and rush of a pheasant. A discarded racer was scarcely the best mount for pottering about after the cubs, but the pursuit of pleasure, that was always a synonym for excitement, had made Veera a fine horsewoman, and she loved the surprises that a light-hearted 4-year-old can give his rider. And when the last cub had been slaughtered, to gratify Mr. Somebody's hounds, Claude and Veera had to ride to please their horses, and there was a spice of danger in the tearing gallop across great stretches of pasture, where the green sward sloped upward or downward to the crumbling edge of the red cliffs, and where they saw the wide blue floor of the sea and the dim outline of the Welsh coast. One morning, when they were riding shoulder to shoulder at a wilder pace than usual, and when Vera's horse was doing his best to get absolute possession of his bridle, she turned with a light laugh to her husband. "Isn't this delicious?" she asked breathlessly, thrilled by the freshness of the air and the rapture of the pace. "Would you mind if we were not able to stop them on this side of the sea?" "Would I mind?" he echoed, looking at her with his careless smile, the smile in which there was often a touch of mockery. "Not I, my love. It wouldn't be half a bad end, to finish one's last ride in a headlong plunge over the cliff, to know none of the gruesome details of dissolution, nothing but a sense of being hurled through bright air, 40 fathoms deep into bright water. All the same, I don't mean these brutes to have their own way," he concluded in his most matter-of-fact tone, with his hand upon Ganymede's bridle. They turned their horses and trotted quietly home, Vera pale and somewhat shaken by the excitement of the long gallop. They were near the end of their country holiday, and they were to part at the end of the week, Claude to spend a fortnight at Newmarket, Vera to start alone for Italy, stopping here and there for a few days, on her way to her Roman villa, where Claude was to join her, bringing his hunters with him, not these light thoroughbreds, but horses of coarser quality and more experience, fitter for the rough work of the Campagna. It had been Vera's own fancy to revisit familiar places in Italy. Claude had been urgent with her to abandon the idea, but she would not listen to him. "I want to see San Marco, where I lived so long with Granny, when we were poor and shabby. Such a humdrum life. I sometimes wonder how I could bear it." "Poor child, it was hard lines for you, but why conjure up the memory of things that were sad? Looking back is always a mistake. Looking back at the old worn-out things. Going back to long-trodden paths. Nobody can afford to do that. Plus ultra is my motto. In Rome there will be plenty for us to do. We must make our third winter more astounding than either of the other two. I know lots of people who are to be there, all sorts of big pots, pretty women, scribblers, painters, soldiers. You will have to invent new features for your evenings, new combinations of all kinds, and you must cultivate the new lights. When the season is over, people must go about saying that Mrs. Rutherford has made Rome." Vera looked at her husband curiously. How shallow he was, after all. How trivial. There were moments when her heart felt frozen. Dreadful moments of disenchantment, in which the man she had loved seemed to change and become a stranger. Moments when she asked herself with a sudden wonder why she had ever loved him. These were but flashes of disillusion. A touch of tenderness, a thought of all they had been to each other, and her bitter need of his love, made her again his slave. From the hour when he surrendered his chance of redemption and came to her in her Roman garden, came to claim her with passionate words of love, he had been something more than her lover and her husband. He had been her master, ruling her life even in its trivialities, with a mind so shallow that it could find delight in details, leading and directing her in an existence where there was to be no room for thought. He had planned their days at Disbrowe so that there should be no margin for ennui. When they were not riding, they were on the yacht, racing round the coast to Boscastle or Padstow, or they were playing tennis or croquet with the house party, creating an atmosphere of excitement. They parted at Disbrowe, Claude leaving for Newmarket, and they were not to meet till November, when he was to find Vera established in the Roman villa. All gaiety and excitement seemed to have left her with him, and Aunt Mildred remarked the change. "You ought to have gone to Newmarket with your husband," she said, "though I have always thought it a horrid place for women. A place where they think of nothing but horses, and talk nothing but racing slang, and are as full of their bets as professional bookmakers. I hate horsey women, but you and Claude are such a romantic couple that it seems a pity you should ever be separated." "Romance cannot last for ever, my dear aunt. We have been married nearly 3 years. It is time we became like other people. I have just your feeling about Newmarket. I was keen about the stud for the first year or two, petting the horses and watching their gallops in the early mornings. And then it began to seem childish to care so much about them. And whether they won or lost, it was the same thing over and over again. The trainer and his boys said just the same things about every success and every defeat. The crack jockeys were all the same, and I hardly knew one from another. I still love the horses for their own sake, and I am miserable if any of them are sold into bondage. But I am sick to death of the whole business." There was a fortnight to spare before Vera was to start for Italy, and Lady Okehampton wanted her to stay at Disbrowe till a day or two before she left England. "Portland Place will be awfully triste," she said. "I cannot see why you should go and bury yourself alive there for a fortnight." Vera pleaded preparations, clothes to order for the winter. "Surely not in London, when you can stop in Paris and get all you want." There were other things to be done, arrangements to be made, Vera told her aunt. A certain portion of the staff was to start for Rome by direct and rapid journeying, while she, with only her maid and a footman, was to travel by easy stages along the Riviera. Lady Okehampton was rather melancholy in the last hour she and her niece spent together in her morning room. "I'm afraid the pace at which you and Claude are taking life must wear you out before long," she said. "You are never quiet, always rushing from one thing to another, even here, where I wanted you to come for absolute rest, just to dawdle about the gardens and doze in a hammock all the afternoon, with a quiet evening's bridge. But you have given yourself no more rest here than in London. Okehampton told me the way you tore about on those ungovernable horses, miles and miles away over the moor, while other people were jogging after the hounds, or waiting about in the lanes. He said it was not cubbing, but skylarking. And the skipper complained that Mr. Rutherford insisted on sailing the yacht in the teeth of a dangerous gale." "He is the generousest gentleman I have ever been out with," old Peter said. "But he is the recklessest, and I wouldn't give twopence for his chance of making old bones." "Poor old Peter," sighed Vera. "We often had a squabble with him, what he called a stand further. He's a conscientious old dear and a fine sailor, but he would never have found the shortest way to India." "You wanted rest, Vera, but instead of resting you have done all the most tiring things you could invent for yourself." "Claude is the inventor, not I, and it is good for me to be tired, to lie down with weary limbs and fall into a dreamless sleep, or into a sleep where the dreams are sweet and bring back lost things." "I should not say all this if I were not anxious about your health," Aunt Mildred continued gravely. "You look well and brilliant at night, but your morning face sometimes frightens me, and you are woefully thin, a mere shadow. It is all very well for people to call you ethereal, but I don't want to see you wasting away." "There is nothing the matter. I was always thin. I have a little cough that sometimes worries me at night, but that has been much better since I came here." "You ought to take care of your health, Vera. You have a great responsibility." "How do you mean?" "Have you ever thought of those who have to come after you? Do you ever consider that your splendid fortune dies with you, and that your power to help those members of our family who need help, alas, too many of them, depends upon your enjoying a long life?" "My dear aunt, I cannot promise to spin out a tedious existence in order to find money for poor relations." That remark is not quite nice from you, Vera. You yourself began life as a poor relation." "I have not forgotten, and I have given my needy cousins a good deal of money since I have been rich, and of course I shall go on doing so." "As your aunt and the most attached of all your own people, I must ask a delicate question, Vera. Have you made your will?" Lady Okehampton asked this question with such a thrilling awfulness that it sounded like a sentence of death. "No, aunt. Why should I make a will? I have nothing to leave. You know I have only a life interest in the Provana estate." "Nothing to leave? But your accumulations, your surplus income." "I don't think I can have any surplus. Claude and I have spent money freely, at home and abroad, and I have given large sums for the foundation of a hospital in Rome in memory of Mario and his daughter. Claude manages everything for me. I have never asked him whether there was any money left at the end of the year." "And of that colossal income, which you have enjoyed for 5 years, you have nothing left? It is horrible to think of. What mad waste, what incredible extravagance there must have been. You ought not to have left everything in Claude's hands. Such a careless, happy-go-lucky fellow ought never to have had the sole management of your immense income. It would make Signor Provana turn in his grave to know that his wealth has been wasted." "He would not care. We never cared for money." "Nothing left at the year's end? Nothing of that stupendous wealth? It is monstrous." "Don't agitate yourself, dear Aunt Mildred. There may have been a surplus every year. I never asked Claude whether there was or not. But I shall always be rich enough to help my poor relations." There was no time for further remonstrance. Aunt Mildred parted from her niece with more sighs than kisses, though those were many. She perused the sweet pale face with earnest scrutiny, for she thought she saw the mark of doom on the forehead, where the lines were deeper than they should have been on the sunny side of 30. She remembered the short-lived mother, the consumptive father. End of chapter 26, part 1. Chapter 26, Part 2 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 26, Part 2. Vera sat in a corner of the reserved compartment and read Browning's Christmas Eve all through the swift journey from the red cliffs of North Devon and the wide blue sky to the grey dullness of a London twilight. It was a poem which she read again and again, which she knew by heart. It lifted her out of herself. She felt as if she were out in the winter darkness on the wind-swept common, as if her hands were clutching the edge of the divine raiment. Was not that sublime vision something more than a dream in a stuffy Methodist chapel? Were there not moments in life when earth touched heaven, when divine compassion was something more real than the words in a book, when Christ the Redeemer came within reach of the sinner, and when faith became certainty? Nothing less than this, nothing but the assurance of a living God, could lift the despairing soul out of the abyss. The house to which she was returning was a house of fear, and in spite of all she had said to her aunt, she knew that there was no necessity for her return. The rich man's widow had nothing to do that a telegram to her housekeeper would not have done for her. But the house drew her somehow. She had a morbid longing to be there, alone in the silence and emptiness of unused rooms, without Claude, whose presence jarred in rooms where another figure was still master. She found all things in perfect order, no speck of dust in the rooms on the ground floor. her morning room brilliant with Japanese chrysanthemums. She went to the library after her solitary dinner. The evening was cold, and fires were burning in all the rooms. She drew a low chair to the hearth, and sat brooding over the smouldering cedar logs, perhaps one of the loneliest women in London. And yet not quite alone, since nothing that had happened in her futile life of the last years had shaken her belief in Mr. Symeon's creed, and she felt that the dead were near her. Julia, who had loved her, Julia, the happy soul who had known neither sin nor sorrow, the yearning of unsatisfied love, or the seething fires of guilty passion. Julia's gentle spirit had been with her of late, the spirit of her only girl-friend, and she had lived over again the tranquil hours at San Marco, the talk of books that had opened a new world to her, Julia having read so much and she so little. Father and daughter had opened the gates of that new world for her. It was from them that the poet's daughter had learnt to understand and love all that is highest in the poetry of the world. If Julia had lived, she thought tonight, as she crouched over the lonely hearth, sitting in that low chair in which she used to sit, as it were, at her husband's feet, sometimes in the dreamy twilight letting her drooping head rest upon his knee, while his hand hovered caressingly over the blonde hair. Had Julia lived, would everything have been different? Would Mario have loved and married her, and would they three have lived in a trinity of love? It seemed to her that Julia would have been a hallowing influence. They two would have been like sisters, loving and understanding the man who loved them both. No cloud of jealousy could have come between them. All would have been sympathy and understanding. That wall of separation which had risen up between her and her husband would never have been. Neither pride on her part nor distrust upon his part would have killed love. Julia would have sympathised with both, and her love would have kept them united. She mused long upon the life that might have been, the life without a cloud. She thought with longing of the girl who had died sinless in the morning of an unsullied life. Was not such a life, wrapped round with love and free from the shadow of sin, such a death, before satiety had come to change the gold to dross, the happiest fate that God could give to his chosen? And to think that I was sorry for her, that I pitied her for being taken from such a beautiful world, from such a devoted father. How could I know that death was the only security from sin? She sat long in that melancholy reverie, only rousing herself and taking up a book from the table at her side when she heard the door opening and a servant came in to put fresh logs on the fire. She told the man that her maid, Louison, was not to sit up for her. Nobody was to sit up. She would not be going upstairs for some time. She wanted nothing, and she would switch off the lights. In a house lighted by electricity, the lights were of very little consequence. The footman took elaborate pains with the fire, piling up the logs, and arranging the large brass guard that fenced the hearth, and then retired with ghostly step to remote regions, where his fellows were lingering over the supper table, some of them talking of the journey to Rome, and those who were to remain in charge of the house complaining of the dullness of a long winter, and the low figure of board wages, which had remained more or less stationary, while everything else was going up by leaps and bounds. "I'd leap and bound you if I had my way," said Mr. Sedgewick. "A pack of lazy trash. If I were Mr. Rutherford, I should put a policeman and a bulldog into the house and lock it up till next May. You that are left have a deal too soft a time, while we that go have to work like galley slaves. 3 parties a week, and a pack of Italian savages to keep up to the mark. Fellows who are more used to daggers and stilettos than to soap and water. Better for a brigand's cave than a high-class pantry, and who think nothing of quarrelling and threatening to murder each other in the middle of a dinner party. There's no sense in a mixed staff. My pantry was a regular pandemonium last Christmas, and I wished myself back in sooty old London." Mrs. Manby was to stay in Portland Place, mistress of the Silent House, with 1 footman, 2 housemaids to sweep and dust, and a kitchen wench to cook for her. She had saved money, and was independent, and even haughty. "When I go to Italy it will be to the Riviera for my health, and I shall go as a lady," she told Sedgwick, who, notwithstanding his abhorrence of Roman footmen, liked his winter in Rome, as a period that afforded better pickings than even a London season, Italian tradesmen being more amenable than London purveyors, who had been harassed and bound of late by grandmotherly legislation. Supper had been finished in hall and housekeeper's parlour long before Vera left the library. It was after midnight when a sudden shivering, a vague horror of the silence came upon her, and she rose from her low chair in front of the dying fire and began to wander from room to room. The last of the logs had dropped into grey ashes in the library, and all other fires had gone out. The formal room, with large official-looking chairs and severe office desk, where Mario Provana had received formal visitors, was the abode of gloom in this dead hour of the night. And yet it was not empty. The sound of the dead man's voice was in the room, the voice of command, so strong, so stern in those grave discussions which Vera had often overheard through the half-open door of the library in the days when she had shared her husband's life, before fashion and disbrowse had parted them. His image was in the room, the massive figure, the commanding height, the broad shoulders, a little bent, as if with the weight of the noble head they had to carry. He was standing in front of his desk, facing those other men with the grave look she knew so well, courteous, serious, resolute. And then slowly, with a movement of weariness at the conclusion of an interview, he sank into the spacious arm-chair. She saw him tonight as she had seen him often, watching through the open door, while she was waiting for the business people to go, and for him to join her for their afternoon drive. What ages ago, those tranquil days in which they had driven together in the summer afternoons. Not the dull circuit of the park, but to Hampton Court, or Wimbledon, or Richmond, or Esher, escaping from the suburban flower gardens to green fields and rural commons, glimpses of woodland even, in the country about Claremont. Their airings were no swift rushes in 30-horsepower car, but a leisurely progress behind a pair of priceless horses, with time for seeing wild roses and honeysuckle in the hedges, the dogs and children on rustic paths, and the peace of cottage gardens. She remembered how those tranquil afternoons had become impossible by reason of her perpetual engagements, and how quietly Mario Provana had submitted to the change in her way of life, the succession of futile pleasures, the hurry and excitement. "I want you to be happy," he told her, when she made a feeble apology for not having an afternoon at his service. "You are young, and you must enjoy your youth. Things that seem trivial and joyless to me are new and sweet to you. Be happy, love. I have plenty of use for my time." That was in the beginning of their drifting apart. Looking back tonight, she could but wonder, as she remembered how gradually, how imperceptibly that drifting apart had gone on, until she awoke one day to find that she and her husband were estranged. He was kind, had only an indulgent smile for the folly of her life, but the happy union of their first wedded years was over and done with. In Lady Susan's brief phrase, they had become like other people. And now she and Claude Rutherford had drifted apart, and were like other people. The reunion of a few weeks at Disbrowe was but a flash of summer across the gathering gloom of their lives. "He can be happy," she thought, brooding in the night silence. "He cares for so many things. I care for nothing but the things that are gone." And then, while the clock of All Souls struck that solemn single stroke, which has even a more awful note than the 12 strokes of midnight, she thought of her dead, all her dead. Her poets, Tennyson, Browning, Swinburne, men who had lived while she was living, and one by one had vanished. Of the great tragic actor whose genius had thrilled her childish heart. Of all that company of the great who had died long before she was born. And it seemed to her in her dejection as if the earth were an empty desert, in which nothing great or beautiful was left. They had all gone through the dark gates of death, across the wild that no man knows. Her poet father, her lovely young mother, phantoms of beauty, distant and dim, evanescent shadows in the memory of a child. Yet, if Francis Symeon's creed were true, they were not gone forever. They had not gone across the wild to dark distances beyond the reach of human thought. They were only emancipated. The worm had cast its earthly husk, and the spirit had spread its wings. Released from the laws of space and time, the all-understanding mind of the dead could be in sympathy with the elect among the living. With us, the elect, who have renounced the joys of sense and lived only to cultivate the pleasures of the mind. For us, the poets we worship still live. The minds that have been the light and leading of our minds are our companions and friends. We need no salaried medium's abracadabra to summon them, no weary waiting round a table in a darkened room, disturbed by suspicions of trickery. They come to us uncalled, as we sit alone in the gloaming, or wander alone over the desolate down, or by the long sea shore. The poem we read is suddenly illuminated with the soul of the poet. The printed page becomes a message from the immortal mind. Tonight, in that silent hour, it was only of the dead Vera thought, as she wandered from room to room in the house of fear, shrinking from the prospect of the long sleepless hours, weary yet restless. Restlessness made her wander into regions that were almost strange. She drew aside a heavy curtain and pushed open a crimson cloth door that led from the hall of ceremony to those inferior regions common to servants and tradesmen. The long stone passage, with doors right and left, the passage that ended at the door into the stable yard, the door by which Mario Provana had entered on the night of his death. Rarely had her foot trodden the stone pavement, yet every detail of the place, the form of the doors, the white ceiling, the unlovely drab walls, had been burned into her brain. A single electric lamp gave the kind of light that is more awful than darkness. She heard clocks ticking, one that sounded solemn and slow, as if it were some awful mechanism that was measuring the fate of men. One with a thin and hurried beat, like the pulse of fever. She heard the heavy breathing of more than one sleeper, and presently, in front of the yard door, she came upon the watchdog, the Irish terrier, Boroo. He was lying asleep on a rug in front of the door, and her light step upon the stone had not roused him. It was only when she was close to his rug that he started up and gave a low, muffled bark, and sniffed at the skirt of her dress, and being assured that she was to be trusted, sprang up with his forefeet upon her hip and licked her hands. She stooped over him and stroked his rough head, and let him nestle close against her, and then she knelt down beside him and put her arms round him, and fondled him as he had never been fondled before by so beautiful and delicate a creature. From those long thoughts of a world peopled by the dead, the spontaneous love of this warm, living creature touched her curiously. There was comfort in contact with anything so full of life, and she laid her cold cheek against the dog's black nose, called him by his name, and made him her friend forever. "Poor old dog, all alone in this cold place. Come upstairs with me. Come, Boroo." The house dog needed no second invitation. He kept close to her trailing silken skirt as she moved slowly through the hall, switching off lights as she went, and so by the stately staircase to the second floor. The fire in her morning room had been made up at a late hour by Louison, who was now accustomed to her mistress's nocturnal habits, and the logs were bright on the hearth and brightly reflected on the hedge-sparrow egg blue of the tiled fireplace. The terrier looked round the room with approval. Till this night he had seen nothing finer than Mrs. Manby's parlour, where, when occasionally suffered to lie in front of the fire, he had always to be on his best behaviour. But in Vera's room he made himself at once at home, jumped on and off the prettiest chairs, rioted among the silken pillows on the sofa, looking at her with questioning eyes all the time, to see what liberties he might take, and finally stretched his yellow-red body at full length in the glow and warmth of the hearth, wagging a lazy tail with ineffable bliss. Vera seated herself in a low chair near him, and stooped now and then to pat the broad, flat head. He was a big dog of his kind, and though intended only for the humblest service, to rank with kitchen and scullery maids and under footmen, he was naturally, in that opulent household, a well-bred animal of an unimpeachable pedigree. His parents and grandparents had been prize-winners, and his blood might have entitled him to a higher place than the run of the servants' halls and stables, and a mat in a stone passage. But whatever his inherited merits or personal charms, Vera's sudden liking for him had nothing to do with his race or character. It was the chill desolation of the silent hour, the freezing horror of the empty house, that had made her heart soften and her tears fall at the contact of this warm, living creature in the world of the dead. It was almost as if she had lost her way in one of the Roman catacombs, and had met this friendly animal among the dead of 1,000 years, and in the horror of impenetrable darkness. "You are my dog now, Boroo," she told the terrier, and the small, bright, dark eyes looked up at her with a light that expressed perfect understanding, while the pointed ears quivered with delight. He followed her to the threshold of her bedroom, where she showed him a white fleecy rug on which he was to sleep, outside her door. He threw himself upon his back, with his 4 legs in the air, protesting himself her slave, and from that hour he worshipped her, and followed her about her house in abject devotion. He went with her to Italy. Of course there would be difficulties about his return to England, but canine quarantine might be ameliorated for a rich man's dog. He became her companion and friend, and it was strange how much he meant in her life. Strange, very strange, for in all the years of folly and self-indulgence she had never given herself a canine favourite. She had seen almost every one of her friends more or less absurdly devoted to some small creature: Griffon, Manchester Terrier, Pekingese, Japanese, King Charles, Pomeranian, dogs whose merits seemed in an inverse ratio to their size, or the slaves to some more dignified animal, poodle or chow. She had seen this canine slavery, and had wondered with a touch of scorn. And now, in the stately spaciousness of the Roman villa, she found herself listening for the patter of the Irish terrier's feet upon the marble floors, and rejoicing when he came bounding across the room to lay his head upon her knee, and express unutterable affection with the exuberance of a rough, hairy tail. The clue to the mystery came to her suddenly as she sat musing in the firelight, with Boroo stretched at her feet. She had wanted this dog. She had wanted some warm-hearted creature to love her, and to be loved by her. It had been the vacant house of her life that called for an inhabitant. She had awakened from her fever dream of happiness to find herself alone, utterly alone, in a world of which she was weary. Claude Rutherford was of no more account to her. The thing that had happened was something worse than drifting apart. Gradually and imperceptibly the distance between them had widened, until she had begun to ask herself if she had ever loved him. Boroo went with his mistress on the long journey to San Marco, and behaved with an admirable discretion at the big hotel at Marseilles, where, though he would have liked to try conclusions with a stalwart dogu de Bordeaux that he met in one of the long corridors, he contented himself with a passing growl as he crept after Vera to his post outside her room. All things were strange to him in these first continental experiences, but he bore all things with sublime restraint, concentrating all his brain power and all his emotional force on the one supreme duty of guarding the lovely lady who had adopted him. At the Hôtel des Anglais, Mrs. Rutherford was received with rapture, and the spacious suite on the first floor was, as it were, laid at her feet. She would, of course, occupy those rooms, and no other, the rooms where Signor Provana and his sweet young daughter had lived. Signor Canincio ignored the fact that the sweet young daughter had also died there. No, Mrs. Rutherford would have the rooms in which she had lived with her grandmother. "I want our old rooms, please," she said. "The rooms in which you were so happy, where you spent 2 winters with the illustrious Lady Felicia." Signor Canincio at once perceived how natural it was for Madame to prefer those rooms. Everything should be made ready immediately. His season had not yet begun, but his hotel would be full to overflowing in December, when he expected many of Madame's old friends to settle down for the winter. Vera smiled as she remembered those old friends with whom she had never been friendly, the sour spinsters and widows who had always resented Lady Felicia's determination to deny herself the advantage of their society. It was the dead season of the year. The late lingering roses on the walls had a sodden look, the pepper trees drooped disconsolately, and a curtain of grey mist hung over the parade, where Vera had walked, alone and dejected, before the coming of Julia and her father. The hills where they had driven looked farther away in the shadowy atmosphere. There was no gleaming whiteness on the distant mountains. All was grey and melancholy, and in unison with her thoughts of the dead. She had come there to look upon her husband's grave. She had been prostrate and helpless at the time of his burial, and had only just been capable of arousing herself from a state of apathy to insist that he should be carried back to the country of his birth, and should lie beside his daughter in the shadow of the cypresses between the sea and the olive woods. Even in that agonizing time, the picture of that familiar spot had been in her mind as she gave her instructions, and she had seen the marble tomb in its green enclosure, and the tall trees standing deeply black against the pale gold of the sky, as on that evening when Mario Provana had found her sitting by his daughter's tomb. He must lie there, she told his partner, nowhere else, no, not even in Rome, where his family had their stately sepulchre. It was under the marble tomb he had made for his idolized child that he must rest. And now, in the dull grey November, she stood once more beside the marble and read the lines that had been graven under Julia's brief epitaph. also in memory of Mario Provana, her father, who died in London on July the 13th, 19 , in the 57th year of his age. And below this one word, reunited. She stayed long in the green enclosure, her dog coming back to her after much exploration of the wood above, where he had startled and scattered any animal life that he could find there, and the seashore below, where he stirred the tideless waves by the vehemence of his plunges. And then she went for a long ramble in the familiar paths where she had walked with Provana in those sunny afternoons, before the ride to the chocolate mills. She stayed nearly a week at San Marco, repeating the same process every day. First a lingering visit to the grave, and then a long lonely walk in the paths she had trodden with the man whom she had thought of only as her friend's father, until, by an imperceptible progress, he had made himself the one close friend of her life. She took pains to find the very paths they had trodden together, the humble shrines or chapels they had looked at, the rocks where they had sat down to rest. When she had first spoken of revisiting San Marco, Claude had done his uttermost to dissuade her. "Don't be morbid," he had said more than once. "Your mind has a fatal leaning that way. You ought to fight against it." Yes, she knew that she was morbid, that she had taken to brooding upon melancholy memories, that she was cultivating sadness. Alone in the olive wood, watching the evening light change and fade, and the shadows steal slowly from the valley and the sea, while memory recalled words that had been spoken in that narrow pathway, among those grey old trees, in the light and shade of evenings that seemed ages ago, she had a feeling that was almost happiness. It was a memory of happiness so vivid that it seemed the thing itself. She had been very happy in those tranquil evenings. She knew now that she had begun to love Mario Provana many days before his impassioned avowal had taken her by storm. His eloquence, his power of thought and feeling, had made life and the world new. She saw Othello's visage in his mind. His rugged features and his 48 years were forgotten in the charm of his conversation and the rare music of his voice. The world of the scholar, of the thinker, and the poet had been an unknown world to the girl of 18, whose poor little bit of flimsy education had been limited to the morning hours of a Miss Greenough at a guinea a week. He opened the gate of that divine world and led her in, and they walked there together, he charmed by her freshness and naivety, she dazzled by his wealth of knowledge and his power of imagination. Not even her poet father could have had a wider knowledge of books or a greater power of thought, she told herself, which was a concession to friendship, as she had hitherto put her father in the front rank of those who know. She looked back at those innocent hours, when he who was so soon to be her husband was only thought of as her first friend. She looked back to hours that seemed to her to have been the happiest in all her life. Yes, the happiest. For happiness is sunshine and calm weather, not fever and storm. There were other hours more romantic and more thrilling, but agonizing to remember, sensual, devilish. Those hours in the woods had been serene and pure, and she had walked there with the heart of a child. How kind he had been, how kind! It was the kindness in the low grey voice that had made its music, only the kindness of a friend of mature years, interested in her youth and ignorance. Only a grave and thoughtful friend, liking her because she had been loved by his dead daughter. That is what she had thought of him for the greater part of those quiet hours. Yet now and then she had been startled by a sudden suggestion. She did not know, but she felt that he was her lover. It was in vain that Signor Canincio pressed her to occupy his piano nobile, as the only part of his hostel worthy of her. She insisted on the old rooms, the salon that had been growing shabbier and shabbier in the years of her absence, and which had never been redecorated. There were the same faded cupids flying about the ceiling, where many a crack in the plaster testified to an occasional earthquake. And there was the same shabby paper on the walls. Nothing had been altered, nothing had been removed. Vera went out upon the balcony and looked down at the little town and the distant ridge where the walls of a monastery rose white against the grey November sky. Everything was the same. She had wanted to come back. It was a morbid fancy, perhaps, like many of her fancies. She knew that she was morbid. She wanted to steep herself in the memories of the time before she was Mario Provana's wife, the time when she knew that he loved her and was proud of his love. She walked up and down the room, touching things gently as she passed them, as if those poor old pieces of furniture, with their white paint and worn gilding, were a part of her history. This was the table where she had sat making tea, a slow process, while Mario stood beside her, watching her, as she watched the blue flame under Granny's old silver kettle, the George II silver that gave a grace to the cheap salon. Lady Felicia had kept her old silver, light and thin with much use, as resolutely as she had kept her diamonds. "If ever I were forced to part with those poor things of mine, I should feel myself no better than the charwoman who comes here to scrub floors," she told Lady Okehampton, and that kind lady, who was taking tea with poor Lady Felicia in her London lodgings, had approved a sentiment so worthy of a Disbrow. Vera paced the room slowly in the thickening light, sometimes standing by the open window, listening to footsteps on the parade, and the talk of the women from the olive woods, tramping bravely homeward with heavy baskets on their heads, baskets of little black olives for the oil mills that dotted the steep sides of the gorge through which the tempestuous little river went brawling down to the sluggish sea. And then she went back into the shadows, and slowly, slowly paced all the length of the room, thinking of those evenings when she had made tea for the Roman financier. The shadows gathered momentarily, and the shape of all things became vague and dim. There was Granny's sofa, and Granny was sitting there among her silken pillows. She could see the pale, thin face, and the frail figure wrapped in a china crape shawl. The white shawl had always had a ghostly look in a dimly lighted room. She went over to the sofa and felt the empty corner where Granny used to sit. No, she was not there. The sofa was a bare, hard object, with nothing phantasmal about it. There were no silken cushions. Those amenities had been Lady Felicia's private property, travelling to and fro by petite vitesse. There was no one on the sofa, and that dark form, the tall figure near the tea-table, was nothing but shadow. It vanished as she came near, and there was only empty space, with the white table shining in the faint light from the open window. "Nothing but shadow," she thought, "like my life. There is nothing left of that but shadow. How happy I must have been when I lived in this room, how happy! But I did not know it. How sweetly I used to sleep, and what dear dreams I dreamt. I was only 17 in our first winter, and I was a good girl. Looking back, I cannot remember that I had ever done wrong. I was always obedient to Granny, and I tried hard to please her, and to care for her when she was ill. I always spoke the truth. The truth? Why should I have been afraid of truth in those days? There was no merit in fearless truth. But the difference, the difference. It seemed so strange now that she had not been happier. To be young and without sin, to believe in God, and to love Christ, was that not enough for happiness? The room was almost dark before she rang for lamps. In that southern paradise, the shutting of windows must precede the entrance of lighted lamps, and one is apt to prolong the time entre un chien en loup. The darkness fostered those morbid feelings that she had indulged of late. She thought of Francis Simeon and his belief in the communion of the living and the dead. Her husband might be near her as she crept about in the darkness. She might know that he was there, but she was not to hope for any visible sign of his presence. To see was reserved for the elect, and for them only when the earthly tabernacle was near its end, when the veil between life and death had worn thin. Then only, and for the choicest spirits only, would that thin veil be rent asunder, and the dead reveal themselves to the living, in a divine anticipation of immortality. Not for all, not for those who have loved earthly things and lived the sensual life, not for them the afterlife of reunion and felicity. Not for me, never for me. She fell on her knees by Granny's sofa and bowed her head upon her folded arms and prayed, a wild and fervent prayer, a distracted appeal for mercy to one who knew and could pity. Such a prayer as might have trembled on the Magdalene's pale lips while, with bent head and hidden countenance, she washed the Redeemer's feet with her tears. The spell that was woven of silence and shadow was broken suddenly by the opening of the door and the tumultuous entrance of the Irish terrier, followed by Louison, who saw only darkness and an empty room. "Mais où donc est madame?" she exclaimed. Boroo had found his mistress by something keener than the sense of sight, and had pushed his cold black nose against her cheek, despite of the bowed head, and leapt about her as she rose to her feet, just in time to hide all signs of agitation, as Signor Canincio's odd man, in a loose red jacket, looking like a reformed bandit, brought in a pair of lamps and flooded the room with light. Louison rushed to shut the windows and exclude cette affreuse bête les moustiques, from whose attentions she herself had suffered. "Mais, madame, pourquoi dépensionner? Vous voilà sans lumière, sans feu, et les fenêtres grandes ouvertes. Accendere donc," to the odd man. "Apporte legno, molto legno, e faire un buon fuoco. Presto, subito, tout de suite." It may be that this noisy solicitude was meant to cover a certain want of attention to her mistress, Mamselle having lingered over the tea-table in the courier's room, where a dearth of couriers at this dead season was atoned for by the presence of Signor Canincio and his English wife, she dispensing the weakest possible tea, with condescending kindness, and wife and husband both alert to hear anything that Louison would tell them about her mistress, while the animated gestures and expressive eyes of the host testified to his admiration for la belle Française, an admiration that was made more agreeable to Louison from the consuming jealousy which she saw depicted in the countenance of the travelling footman, whose inferior status ought to have excluded him from that table. But Louison knew that Canincio's hotel had always been what Mr. Sedgwick called une affaire d'un seul cheval. End of chapter 26, part 2. Chapter 27 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 27. The Roman villa was a fairy palace of light and flowers, and its long range of windows flashed across the blue vapours of the December night, and might have been noticed as a golden glory in the far distance by solitary watchers in the monasteries on the Aventine Hill. It was Vera's first reception, and all that there was of Roman rank and beauty, all that there was of transatlantic wealth and cosmopolitan talent in the most wonderful city in the world, had assembled in prompt response to her card of invitation. Mrs. Claude Rutherford, at home, 9 to 12. Music. The Villa Provana. The financier's palace still bore the stamp of mercantile riches. Claude had urged his wife to give the splendid house a splendid name, so that, in the ever-changing society of the Italian capital, the source of all that splendour might be forgotten. But he had urged in vain. "It was his father's house, and it was my home with him," she said, with a strange look, the look that Claude feared. "While I live, it shall never have any other name." "You are the first woman I ever knew with such a cult of the dismal," he said. "Most widows wish to forget." "Most widows can forget," she answered. He turned and left her at the word, and she heard him singing sotto voce as he went along the corridor, "La donna mobile." "At least I do not change," she thought. This had happened in their first winter in Rome, a mere flash of melancholy, soon forgotten in those wild days when the pace was fastest, and when life went by in a hurricane of fashionable pleasures. Visiting and entertaining, opera and theatre and racecourse, a rush to Naples to hear a wonderful tenor, to Milan to see the new dancer at the Scala, something new and fatiguing for every week and every day. They were both calmer now, and it may be that both were tired, though it was only Vera who talked openly of weariness. To-night she was looking lovely, but a Russian savant, who was among the most illustrious of her guests, whispered to his neighbour as she passed them, "She will not live her 140 years." "I'm afraid it is a question of months rather than years," replied his friend, a famous Roman doctor. Something there was in the radiant face, pale but full of light and life, in which the eye of an expert read auguries of evil. But to the elegant mob circulating through those sumptuous rooms, Mrs. Rutherford was still beautiful with the bloom of health. Her pallor was of a transparent fairness, more brilliant than other women's carnations. The popular American painter had made one of his most startling hits, 2 years before, by his exquisite rendering of that rare beauty, the alabaster pallor, the dreaming eyes, blue-grey, or blue with a touch of green. He had caught her mermaid look, and his most fervent admirers, looking at the portrait in the Academy crowd, declared that the colour in those mysterious eyes changed as they looked. The portrait was the sensation of the year. Her eyes changed, and she seemed to be moving out of the canvas, said the superior critics, and the herd went about parroting them. She had her far-away look to-night, as she stood near the doorway in the Rubens room, the first of the long suite, and though she had a gracious greeting for everybody, those who admired her most had a strange fancy that she was only the lovely semblance or outer shell of a woman, whose actual self was worlds away. There was nothing dreamy or far away about Claude Rutherford to-night. He was a man whose nature it was to live only in the present, and to live every moment of his life. To-night, in these splendid surroundings, in this crowd of the noble and the celebrated, He felt as one who had conquered fate and has the world at his feet. He was a universal favourite. The hearts of women softened at his smile, and even men liked him for his careless gaiety. Always jolly and friendly, and without a scrap of side. That was what they said of him. To have the spending of the Provana millions and to be without side seemed a virtue above all praise. People liked him better than his ethereal wife. She was charming, but elusive. That other world look of hers repelled would-be admirers, and even chilled her friends. The Amphletts had arrived at the villa on a long visit, just in time for Vera's first party, and Lady Susan was floating about the rooms in an ecstasy of admiration. She had never seen them in Mario Provana's time, and though she had been invited by Vera more than once in the last 3 years, this was her first visit. Her tiresome husband had preferred Northamptonshire, and she had not been modern enough to leave him, and now he had been only lured 1,000 miles from the Pytchley by the promise of hunting on the Campagna. At last Vera is in her proper environment, Lady Susan told a young attaché who had been among the intimates in London. She was out of her proper setting in Portland Place. Nothing less beautiful than this palace is in harmony with her irresistible charm. Other women have beauty, don't you know? Mrs. Bellenden, par exemple. Mrs. Bellenden is an eye-opener, murmured the diplomat. Yes, I know what you are thinking. The handsomest woman in Europe, and all that kind of thing, but utterly without charm. Even we women admire her, just as we admire a huge La France rose, or a golden pheasant, or a bunch of grapes as big as plovers' eggs, with the purple bloom upon them, the perfection of physical beauty. But the light behind the painted window, the secret, the charm is not in it. Beauty and to spare, but nothing more. Mrs. Bellenden sailed past them on the arm of the English ambassador while Susie expatiated. It was her first appearance in Roman society, and she was the sensation of the evening. A form as perfect as the Venus of the Capitol, a face of commanding beauty, a toilette of studied simplicity, a gown of dark green velvet, without a vestige of trimming, the décolletage audacious, and for ornament an emerald necklace in a Tiffany setting, which even among hereditary jewels challenged admiration. Just a row of single emeralds clasping a throat of Parian marble. Mrs. Bellenden had the men at her feet, from ambassadors to callow striplings, new to Rome and to diplomacy, sprigs of good family, who were hardly allowed to do more than seal letters or index a letter book. All these courted her as if she had been royal, but the women who had known her in London kept themselves aloof somehow, except the American women, who praised and patronized her, or would have patronized, but for something in those dark violet eyes that stopped them. It isn't safe to say sarcastic things to a woman with eyes like hers, they told each other. It would be as safe to try to take a rise out of a crouching tiger, or to put a cobra's back up for larks. Lady Susan was about the only woman of position who talked to Mrs. Bellenden, but Susie loved notorieties of all kinds, and had never kept aloof from speckled peaches, if the peaches were otherwise interesting. I call Bellenden a remarkable personality, she told Claude, whom she contrived to buttonhole for 5 minutes in the corridor after supper. A rural parson's daughter, brought up on cabbages and the tithe pig, a woman who has spent a year in a lunatic asylum, and yet has brains enough to set the world at defiance. You will see she'll be a duchess, a pucker English duchess, before she has finished. She is more than worthy of the strawberry leaves, but I don't see where the pucker duke is to come from. Her only chance would be a fledgling who had never crossed the Atlantic." If her own sex persisted in a certain aloofness, Mrs. Bellenden had her court, and could afford to do without them. In the picture gallery after supper she was the centre of a circle, and her rich voice and joyous laughter sounded above all other voices in the after midnight hour, when the crowd had thinned and most of the great ladies had gone away. Susie watched that group from a distance, and wondered when Mrs. Bellenden was going to break through the ring of her worshippers and make her way to the Rubens room, where the mistress of the house was waiting to bid the last of her guests good night. The first hour after midnight was wearing on, and Susan Amphlett, who had eaten 2 suppers, each with an amusing escort, was beginning to feel that she had had enough of the party, and would like to be having her hair brushed in the solitude of her palatial bedroom. But she wanted to see the last of Mrs. Bellenden, if not the last of the party. And she kept her cicisbeo hanging on, and pretended to be interested in the pictures, while she furtively observed the proceedings of the notorious beauty. She was making the men laugh. That was the spell she was weaving over the group who stood entranced around her. Light talk that raised lighter laughter, that was her after-midnight glamour. She had been grave and dignified as she moved through the rooms by the side of the ambassador. But now, encircled by a ring of "nice boys," she was frankly bohemian, and amused herself by amusing them, with splendid disregard of conventionalities. Reckless mirth sparkled in her eyes, uproarious laughter followed upon her speech. Whatever she was saying, however foolish, however outrageous, it was simply enchanting to the men who heard her. And in the heart of the ring, Claude Rutherford was standing close beside the lovely freelance, hanging upon her words, joyous, irresponsible as herself. The spell was broken at last, or the fairy laid down her wand, and allowed Claude to escort her to her hostess, who just touched her offered hand with light finger-tips, and thence to the outer vestibule, an octagon room where the white marble faces of Olympian deities, who were immortal because they had never lived, looked with calm scorn upon the flushed cheeks and haggard eyes of men and women too eager to drain the cup of sensuous life. Claude and Mrs. Bellenden stood side by side in the winter moonlight while they waited for carriage after carriage to roll away, before a miniature brougham of neatest build came to the edge of the crimson carpet. They had had plenty of time for whispered talk while they waited, but there had been no more laughter, rather a subdued and almost whispered interchange of confidential speech. And the last word, as he stood by the brougham door, was "tomorrow." Lady Susan and Vera went up the great staircase together, Susie with her usual demonstrative affection, her arm interwoven with her friend's. "Your party has been glorious, darling," she began. "I see now that it is the house that makes the glory and the dream. Your parties in Portland Place were just as good as parties, but oh, the difference! Instead of the vulgar crush upon the staircase, and the 3 overcrowded drawing rooms, immense for London, this luxury of space, this gorgeous succession of rooms, so numerous that it makes one giddy to count them. Vera, I see now that it is only vast space that can give grandeur. The bricks and stone in your London house would have made a street in Mayfair, but it is a hovel compared with this. And to think of that good-for-nothing cousin of mine leaving a bachelor's diggings in St. James's to be lord of this palace. There never was such luck." "I don't think Claude cares very much for the villa, or for Rome," Vera answered coldly. "He prefers London and Newmarket." "That's what men are made of. They don't care for houses or for furniture. They only care for horses and dogs and other women," assented Susan lightly. They were at the door of Vera's rooms by this time, but Susie's entwining arms still held her. "Do let me come in for a cause." "I'm very tired." "Only 5 minutes." "Oh, as long as you like. I may as well sit up and talk as lie down and think." "What? Are you as bad a sleeper as ever?" "I have lost the knack of sleep, but I suppose I sleep enough, as I am alive. Some people talk as if 3 or 4 sleepless nights would kill them, but Sir Andrew Clarke let Gladstone lie awake 7 nights before he would give him an opiate." "But you will lose your beauty. Worse than losing your life. You look lovely to-night. Too lovely, too much like an exquisite phantom. And now, my sweet Vera, don't be angry if I touch upon a delicate, no, an indelicate subject. You must never let Mrs. Bellenden enter your house again." "Indeed, Susie, but why?" "Because she is simply too outrageous." "Do you mean too handsome, too attractive?" "I mean she is absolutely disreputable. If you had seen her in the picture gallery, with a crowd of men round her, your husband among them, laughing immoderately as men only laugh when outrageous things are being said." "And was she saying the outrageous things?" "Undoubtedly. I watched her from a distance, while I pretended to be looking at the pictures. Vera, I don't want to worry you, but that woman is dangerous." "Dangerous?" "Yes, like the Lurlei and people of that class. She is the very woman Solomon described in Proverbs, and he knew. She is a danger for you, Vera, a danger for your peace of mind. She is a wicked enchantress, an enemy to all happy wives, and she is trying to steal your husband." "I'm not afraid." "But you ought to be afraid. Roger and I are not a romantic couple, but if I saw him too attentive to such a woman as Mrs. B., I should, well, Vera, I should take measures. Remember, the woman is the danger. It doesn't matter how much a man flirts, as long as he flirts with the harmless woman. You really should take measures." "That is not in my line, Susie. When my husband has left off caring for me, I shall know it, and that will be the end." Susan looked at her with anxious scrutiny. "I'm afraid you are leaving off caring for him," she said rather sadly. "Never mind, dear. The sands are running through the glass whether we are glad or sorry, and the end of the hour will come." "Don't!" cried Susie, wincing as if she had been hit. "Good night, dear. I am very tired." "Yes, that's what it means." Susie kissed her effusively. "Your nerves are worn to snapping point, you poor pale thing. Good night." Vera was on the Palatine Hill next morning before Lady Susan had left her sumptuous bed, a vast expanse of embroidered linen and down pillows under a canopy of satin and gold. Painted cherubim looked down upon her from the white satin dome. Cherubs or cupids, she was not sure to which order the rosy cheeks and winged shoulders belonged. "They must be cupids," she decided at last. "They have too many legs for cherubim." Vera was wandering among the vestiges of imperial Rome with the dog Boroo for company. She liked to roam about these weedy pathways, among the dust of 100 palaces, in the clear, sunlit morning, at an hour when no tourist's foot had passed the gate. The custodians knew her as a frequent visitor, and left her free to wander among the ruins as she pleased, without guidance or interference. They had been inclined at first to question the Irish terrier's right to the same licence, but a sweet smile and a 10 lire note made them oblivious of his existence. He might have been some phantom hound of mediaeval legend, passing the gate unseen. Simply clad in black cloth, a skirt short enough for easy walking, a loose coat that left her figure undefined, and a neat little hat muffled in a grey gauze veil through which her face showed vaguely, Vera was able to walk about the great city in the morning hours without attracting much notice. Among some few of the shopkeepers and fly drivers who had observed her repeated passage along particular streets, she was known as the lady with the dog. In her wanderings beyond the gates, in places where there were still rural lanes and cottagers' gardens, she would sometimes stop to talk to the children who clustered round her and received the shower of baiocchi which she scattered among them, with tumultuous gratitude, kissing the hem of her gown and calling down the blessings of the Holy Mother on La Bella Signora e la Caro Cane, Buru coming in for his share of blessings. They were lovely children, some of them, with their great Italian eyes, and they would be sunning themselves on the steps of the Trinità del Monte by and by, when the spring came, waiting to attract the attention of a painter on the look-out for ideal infancy. Wicked little wretches, as keen for coin as any Hebrew babe of old in the long-vanished ghetto, dirty and free and happy. But they struck a sad note in Vera's memory, recalling her honeymoon year in Rome, and how fondly Mario Provana had hoped for a child to sanctify the bond of marriage, and to fill the empty place that Giulia's death had left in his heart. A year ago Vera had been killing thought in ceaseless movement, in ephemeral pleasures that left no time for memory or regret. But since the coming of satiety she had found that to think or to regret was less intolerable than to live a life of spurious gaiety, to laugh with a leaden heart, and to pretend to be amused by pleasures that sickened her. Here she found a better cure for painful thought, in a city whose abiding beauty was interwoven with associations that appealed to her imagination, and lifted her out of the petty life of to-day into the life of the heroic past. In Rome she could forget herself, and all that made the sum of her existence. She wandered in a world of beautiful dreams. The dust she trod upon was mingled with the blood of heroes and of saints. She had seen all that was noblest in the city with Mario Provana for her guide, he for whom every street and every church was peopled with the spirits of the mighty dead, from the colossal dome that roofed the tomb of the warrior king who made modern Italy, to the vault where St. Peter and St. Paul had lain in darkness and in chains. She had seen and understood all these things with Mario at her side, enchanted by her keen interest in his beloved city, and delighted to point out and explain every detail. For Mario, every out-of-the-way corner of Rome had its charm. For Claude, Rome meant nothing but the afternoon drive along the Corso, and the bi-weekly meet of hounds on the Appian Way. Everything else was a bore. It was the Palatine where she and Mario had returned oftenest and lingered longest, for it seemed the sum of all that was grandest in the story of Rome, or rather, it was Rome. How often she had stood by her husband's side on this noble terrace, gazing at the circle of hills, and recalling an age when this spot was the centre of the civilized earth. Here were the ruins of a forgotten world, and the palaces of Caligula and Nero seemed to belong to modern history, as compared with the rude remains of a city that had perished before the war god's twins had hung at their fierce foster mother's breast. Every foot of ground had its traditions of ineffable grandeur, and was peopled with ghosts. They stood upon the ashes of palaces more splendid and more costly than the mind of the multimillionaire of to-day had ever conceived, the palaces of poets and statesmen, of Rome's greatest orators, and of her most successful generals, of emperors whose brief reign made but half a page of history, ending in the inevitable murder, of beautiful women with whom poison was the natural resource in a difficulty, of gladiators elevated into demigods, of mothers who killed their sons, and sons who killed their mothers, and of all those 100 palaces, and that strange dream of glory and of crime, there was nothing left but ruined walls, and the dust in which the fool's parsley and the wild parsnip grew rank and high. Amidst those memories of 2000 years ago, Vera felt as if life was so brief and petty a thing, such a mere moment in the infinity of time, that no individual story, no single existence, with its single grief, no wrong done, could be a thing to lament or to brood over. Nothing seemed to matter, when one remembered how all this greatness had come and gone like a ray of sunshine on a wall, the light and the glory of a moment. And what of those grander lives, the Christian martyrs, the men who fought with beasts, and gave their bodies to be burned, the women who went with tranquil brow and steadfast eyes to meet a death of horror, rather than deny the new truth that had come into their lives? There were other, darker memories in her solitary wanderings. She returned sometimes to the hill behind the Villa Medici. She lingered in the dusty road outside the Benedictine monastery, and peered through the iron gate, gazing into the desolate garden, where only the utilitarian portion was cared for, and where shrubs, grass, and the sparse winter flowers languished in neglect, where the gloomy cypresses stood darkly out against the mouldering plaster on the wall, the prison gate within which she had seen her lover sitting by the dying fire, a melancholy figure with brooding eyes that refused to look at her. It would have been better for us both if he had stayed there, she thought. If we had been true to ourselves, we should have parted at the door of his prison for ever. It would have been better for us both, better and happier. The cloister for him and for me. A few years of silence and solitude. A few years of penitential pain, and then the open gate and the Good Shepherd's welcome to the lost sheep. Yes, it would have been better. No pure and abiding joy had come to her from her union with her lover. They had loved each other with a love that had filled the cup of life in the first years of their marriage. They had loved each other, but it had been with a passion that needed the stimulus of an unceasing change of pleasures to keep it alive. And when the pleasures grew stale, and there were no more new things or new places left in the world, their love had languished in the grey atmosphere of thought. She knew that her love for Claude Rutherford was dead. The 3rd year of wedlock had killed it. She looked back and remembered what he had once been to her. She saw the picture of her past go by, a vivid panorama lit by a lurid light, from the July midnight in the rose garden by the river to the November evening in Rome, when he had come back to her from his living grave, and she had fallen upon his breast and had let him set the seal of a fatal love upon her lips, the seal that had made her his in the rose garden and had fixed her fate for ever. This later kiss was more fatal, for it meant the hope of heaven renounced, and a soul abandoned to the sinner's doom. For her part at least, love had died. Slowly, imperceptibly, from day to day, from hour to hour, the glamour had faded, the light had gone. Slowly and reluctantly she had awakened to the knowledge of her husband's shallow nature, and had found how little there was for her to love and honour below that airy pleasantness which had exercised so potent a charm from the hour when she met and remembered the friend of her childhood until the night of the ball, when he had whispered his plan for their future as they spun round in their last waltz. All had shown the likeness of the sunny nature that charmed her. Even in talking of the desperate step they were going to take, he had seemed hardly serious. His confidence was so strong in the future. Just one resolute act, a little unpleasantness perhaps, and then emancipation, and a life of unalloyed happiness. The world forgetting, by the world forgot. Themselves the only world that was worth thinking about. And it was to this shallow nature that she had given her love and her life, for she could see nothing in life outside that fatal love. As that perished, she felt she must die with it. There was nothing left. No child, no forward-looking hopes. But there was the memory of the past. In her lonely walks about the environs of Rome, the past was with her. She was always looking back. She could not tread those paths without remembering who had trodden them with her when the wonder of Rome was new. The man who was her companion, then the strong man, the man of high thoughts and decisive action, the thinker and the worker. The man of grave and quiet manners, who could yet be terrible when the fire below that calm surface was kindled. She had seen that he could be terrible. One episode in their happy honeymoon life had always remained in her memory, when at a crowded railway station he had been separated from her for a few moments in the throng, and had found her shrinking in terror from the insolence of a vulgar dandy. She had never forgotten the white anger in Mario Provana's face as he took the scared wretch by the collar and flung him towards the edge of the platform. She never could forget the rage in that dark face, and it had come back to her in after years in visions of unspeakable horror. He who was so kind could be so terrible. So kind! Now in her lonely wanderings it was of his kindness she thought most, his fond indulgence in those days when he had made the world new for her, days when she had looked back at her long apprenticeship to poverty, the daily lesson in the noble art of keeping up appearances, and Granny's monotonous wailings over cruel destiny, and wondered if this idolized wife could be the same creature as the penniless girl in the shabby lodgings. She knew now that the devoted husband of that happy year was the man who was worthy of something more than gratitude and obedience, something more than duty, worthy of the best and truest love that a good woman could feel for a good man. This was the noble lover. Wherever she went in that city of great memories, the shadow of the past went with her. He was always there. She heard his voice, and the thoughts and feelings of years ago were more real than the consciousness of today. Forgotten things had come back. The fever dream had ended, and in the cold light of an awakened conscience she knew and understood the noble friend and companion she had slighted and lost. Lady Susan was a somewhat exacting visitor, but it was years since she had seen the inside of a dining-room before luncheon, so Vera's mornings were her own. The 12:30 déjeuner even appeared painfully early to Susie, though she contrived to be present at that luxurious meal, where there were often amusing droppers-in, lads from the embassies, soldiers in picturesque uniforms, literary people and artistic people, mostly Americans, people whom Susie could not afford to miss. Vera's mornings were her own. but she was obliged to do the afternoon drive in the Pincio Gardens and along the Corso with Lady Susan, and after the drive she could creep away for an hour to her too spacious saloon, where all the gods and goddesses of Olympus looked down upon her from the tapestry, and sit and dream in the gloaming, or brood over a new novel by Matilda Serrao, her reading lamp making a speck of light in a world of shadows. Here, by the red log fire, where the pine cones hissed and sputtered, the Irish terrier was her happy companion, laying his head upon her knee, or thrusting his black nose into her hand, now and then, to show her that there was somebody who loved her, and only refraining from leaping on her lap by the good manners inculcated in his puppyhood by an accomplished canine educator. Sometimes she would throw down her book, snatch up a fur coat from the sofa where it lay, and go out through the glass door that opened into the gardens. And then, with Boroo bounding and leaping around her, letting off volleys of joyful barks, she would run to the lonely garden at the back of the villa, where there was a long terrace on a ridge of high ground shaded with umbrella pines, and with a statue here and there in a niche cut in the wall of century-old ilex. The solitary walk with her dog in a dark garden always had a quieting effect upon her nerves, like the morning ramble in the outskirts of Rome. To be alone, to be able to think, soothed her. The life without thought was done with. Now to think was to be consoled. Even memories that brought tears had comfort in them. "What can I do for him but remember him and regret him?" she thought. "It is my only atonement. If what Francis Symeon told me is true, and the dead are near us, he knows and understands. He knows and he forgives." Sad, sweet thoughts that came with a rush of tears. These quiet hours helped her to bear the evening gaieties, the evening splendours. She went everywhere that Claude wanted her to go, gave as many parties as he liked, déjeuners, dinners, suppers after opera or theatre, anything. Her gold was poured out like water. The Newmarket horses were running in the Roman races. The Leicestershire hunters were ridden to death on the Campagna. Claude Rutherford was more talked about and more admired than any young man in Rome. He laughed sometimes, remembering the old books, and told them he was like Julius Caesar in his adolescence, a harmless trifler. Claude Rutherford was happy, and he thought that his wife was happy also. Certainly she had been happy at Disbrowe less than half a year ago, and there had been nothing since then to distress her. The long rambles of which Susan told him, the evening seclusion, meant nothing. No doubt she was morbid. She had always been morbid. If she had a grief of any kind, she loved to brood upon it. "What grief can she have?" Susan asked. "There never was such a perfect life. She has everything." "I don't know. We have no children. She may long for a child." "Do you feel the want of children?" Susan asked bluntly. "Yes. I should have liked a child. Our houses are silent, infernally silent. A house without children seems under a curse somehow." Susan looked at him with open-eyed wonder. This trivial cousin of hers, who seemed to live only for ephemeral delights, this man to sigh for offspring, to want his futile career echoed by a son. He who was neither soldier nor senator, who had no rag of reputation to bequeath, what should he want with an heir? And to want childish voices in his home, to complain of loneliness, he who was never alone. Mrs. Bellenden had not been invited to the Villa Provana after the night when Susie had made her protest, nor had Claude urged his wife to invite her. Mrs. Bellenden had begun to be talked about in Rome very much as she had been talked about in London. The noblest of the Roman palaces had not opened their cyclopean doors to her. There were certain afternoons when all that was most distinguished in Roman society crossed those noble thresholds, as by right, went in and came out again, not much happier or richer in ideas perhaps for the visit, but just a shade more conscious of superiority. Mrs. Bellenden, driving up and down the Corso, saw the carriages waiting, and scowled at them as she went by. Mrs. Bellenden was not bien vue in Rome. The painters and sculptors raved about her, and she had to give sittings, for head and bust, to several of them. She was one man's Juno and another man's Helen of Troy. Her portrait, by a famous American painter, was to be the rage at next year's picture show. If to be worshipped for her beauty could satisfy a woman, Mrs. Bellenden might have been content, but she was not. Her exclusion from those 3 or 4 monumental palaces made her feel herself an outsider, and she bristled with fury when no more cards of invitation came from the Villa Provana. "I suppose that white rag of a woman is jealous," she thought, but she had just so much womanly pride left in her as to refrain from asking Claude Rutherford why his wife ignored her. Lady Susan had not even spoken of Mrs. Bellenden after the night when she had delivered herself of a friendly warning, but although she did not talk to Vera of the siren, she had plenty to say to other people about her, and plenty to hear. "I hope that foolish cousin of mine is not carrying on with that odious woman," she had tentatively said to more than one great lady. "Why, my dear creature, everybody knows that he is making an idiot of himself about her. She is riding his hunters to death, and she made an exhibition of herself at the races last Sunday, when one of Rutherford's horses won by half a length, putting her arms round the winner's neck and shaking hands with the jockey. The King and Queen and all the Quirinal party were looking at her. She's the kind of woman who always advertises an intrigue. After all, I believe she is not half so bad as people think her, only she can't keep an affair quiet. She must always play to the gallery." Susie shook her head, with a sigh that was almost a groan. "Oh, my poor Vera, so sweet, so pure, so ethereal." "That's where it is, my dear," said her friend. "Men don't care for those ethereal women long. Women hold men by their vices, not by their virtues." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 28. It was the end of February, and the Roman villa was soon to be left to cobwebs and custodians. The Piazza di Spagna and the broad steps of the Trinità were alive with spring flowers, and the air had the soft sweetness of an English April on the verge of May. White lilac and Maréchal Niel roses were in all the shops. Bright yellow jonquils and red and blue anemones filled the baskets of rustic hawkers at the street corners. Rome's innumerable fountains plashed and sparkled in the sun, and Rome's delicious atmosphere, at once soft, caressing, and inspiriting, made the heart glad. The carnival was over and the season was waning. Lady Susan Amphlett was never tired of telling people that she had had the best time she had ever had in her life. Excursions to Naples, Florence, and all the cities of Tuscany. Motor drives to every place worth seeing within 50 miles of Rome. a midnight party with fireworks in the baths of Caracalla, a dance by torchlight, and a champagne supper in the Colosseum. In this latter festivity the strangeness of the scene had been too exciting, and the revel had almost degenerated into an orgy. "My cousin is simply wonderful at inventing things," Susie, playing her accustomed part of chorus, told people, "and he gets permissions and privileges that no one else would dare ask for." The end had come. To-morrow's meet at the tomb of Cecilia Metella was the last of the season, and Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford were to start for London on the following day. A long journey in a lit salon, with the monotony of dinner waggon meals to make the journey odious. "If one could only take a box of Bath buns and foie gras sandwiches," sighed Susie. "With those and my tea basket I should be utterly happy. But the same insipid omelette and the same tough chicken and endive salad for 48 hours. Quelle corvée!" It was the last morning, a lovely morning. Sunshine was flooding the great rooms and making even the tapestried walls look gay. Susan, for once in her life, came down to breakfast, in a black satin négligée, with a Valenciennes cap that made her look enchanting. "I wanted to see Claude in pink, Roman pink," she said, looking at the slim, tall figure in Leicestershire clothes. "You ought to always wear those clothes," said Susie, clapping her hands as at the reception of her favourite actor. "They make you bewilderingly beautiful. Now I know why you are so keen on hunting." "Do you think any man cares how his coat is cut, or who made his boots, when he may be dead at the bottom of a ditch before the end of the run?" Claude said, laughing. "Some of the best days I've had have been in rat-catcher clothes." He was radiant with pleasant expectations. He could do without Leicestershire hedges and 100-acre fields and all the perfection of English fox hunting. To-day the Campagna would be good enough, with its rough ground and yawning chasms, wider and deeper than the worst of the Somersetshire rhines. The Campagna would be good enough. He was in high spirits, and he was singing a wicked little French song as his man buckled on his spurs, a little song that Gavroche and his companions of the Paris gutters had been singing all the winter. Lady Susan drove to the meet in one of the Provana carriages, picking up a couple of lively American friends on her way. Vera excused herself from going with her friend, and went off for a ramble with the Irish terrier, much to Susie's disgust. "You like that rough-haired beast's company better than mine," she complained. "Only when I want to be alone with memories and dreams." "You are growing too horribly morbid, Vera. I'm afraid you have taken up religion. It's very sweet of you, darling, but it's the way to lose your husband. Religion is the one thing a husband won't put up with. He hates it worse than a bad cook." "No, I have not taken up religion." "Then it's spiritualism, which is just as bad. It's all Mr. Symeon's doing. You live in a world of ghosts." "There are ghosts that one loves. But there will be no ghosts where I shall be walking to-day, only wild flowers and spring sunshine." She watched Susan take her seat in the carriage, a vision of coquettish prettiness and expensive clothes. Susan's husband had gone back to London and Newmarket some time since, not being able to "stick" Rome after the Craven meeting. He had enjoyed some good runs with the Roman pack, and he had been shown St. Peter's and the Colosseum, and had played bridge with famous American players at Claude Rutherford's club. So what more was there for him to do? Vera and her dog went to the Campagna by a roundabout way that avoided that noble road between the tombs of the mighty by which the hunting men and their followers would go. She roamed in rural lanes where violets and wild hyacinths were scenting the warm air, and sat in a solitary nook musing over a volume of Carducci, while Boroo hunted the hedge and scratched the bank, in a wild quest of the rats that haunted his dreams as he sprawled on the Persian prayer rug before the fire. It was late afternoon when Vera left the quiet lane and turned into the dusty road that led to the tomb of Cecilia Metella, lingering on her way to admire a team of those magnificent fawn-coloured and cream-white oxen whose beauty always went to her heart. She recalled Carducci's lovely sonnet, Il Bove, those exquisite lines which Giulia Provana had repeated to her as they drove along the rural roads near San Marco, and which she learned from her friend's lips before she had ever seen a printed page of the Italian's verse. All signs of horse and hound had disappeared before she came to Cecilia's tomb. There were no people in carriages, no loitering peasants or British bicyclists, waiting about on the chance of a ringing run, which would bring pack and field sweeping round the wide plain in sight of the starting point. There was no one, only the vast expanse of greyish-green herbage, with here and there a heap of ruins that had been a palace or a tomb, and here and there a red-capped shepherd and his flock. Vera strolled along the grass, taking no heed of vehicles or foot passengers on the higher level of the Appian Way. She had her time chiefly engaged in keeping Boroo to heel, where only duty could keep him, instinct and a passionate inclination urging him to make a raid on the sheep. Distance would have been as nothing. He would have crossed the expanse of rugged ground in a flash, if Vera's frown and Vera's threatening voice had not subjugated that which, next to fighting, was a master passion. She was absorbed in her endeavour to keep the faithful beast under control, when the sound of laughter on the road above made her come to a sudden stop, and look and listen. She knew the laugh. It had once been music in her ears. That frank, joyous laugh, the ripple of gladness that defied the fates, had once been an element in the glamour that cast its spell over her life. But now the laugh jarred. There was a false note in the music. A woman was riding at Claude's bridle hand, their horses walking slowly, close together, and he was leaning over her to listen and to talk. His hand was on her saddle, and their heads were very near as he bent to speak and to listen. Vera could hear their voices in the clear air of a Roman sundown, but not the words that they were speaking. One thing only was plain, that after each scrap of talk there came the ripple of joyous laughter from the man, and then, after a little more talk, with head still closer, the boisterous mirth of a reckless woman. The woman was Mrs. Bellenden. What other rider after those Roman hounds had a figure like hers? The exquisite lines, the curves of bust and throat that the sculptors were talking about? The woman was Mrs. Bellenden, in one of her amusing moods. That was her charm, as Susan Amphlett had explained it to Vera. She made men laugh. "That is her secret," said Susan. "She remembers all the stories her madcap husband told her when she was young and they shocked her. She dishes them up with a spice of her own, and she makes men laugh. She can keep them dangling for a year and hold them at arm's length, while a mere beauty would bore them after a month, unless she came to terms. That's her secret. But, of course, it comes to the same in the end. Such a woman's affairs must have the inevitable conclusion. Her pigeons last longer in the plucking, and she gets more feathers out of them. You had better look after your husband before he goes too far." Nothing had moved Vera from her placid acceptance of fate. I suppose my husband must amuse himself with a flirtation now and then, when his racing stable begins to pall," she said. "Vera, you and Claude are drifting apart!" exclaimed Susie, with a horrified air. It was a gruesome discovery for Chorus, who had gone about the world singing the praises of this ideal couple, these exquisite married lovers, and talking about Eden and Arcadia. Vera smiled an enigmatic smile. Drifting apart? No, it was not drifting apart. It was a cleft as wide and deep as one of those yawning chasms on the Campagna, that the sportsmen boasted of jumping with their Northamptonshire hunters. This was Vera's last day in Rome. They started on the homeward journey next morning, but instead of travelling with her husband by the Paris express, she took it into her head to linger on the way. She stopped at Pisa, she stopped at Portofino, she stopped at Genoa, and last of all she stopped at San Marco to look at Mario Provana's grave. "I may never see Italy again," she said when Susan tried to dissuade her. "I have a presentiment that I shall never see this dear land any more." "For my part, I should not be sorry if I knew I was never coming back to the villa," her husband answered. "It is too big for a house to live in. It must soon fall to the fate of other Roman palaces, and become one of the sights of the city, to be shown for 2 lire a head to Dr. Lunn and his fellow travellers." Vera had her way. In this respect she and her husband were essentially modern. They never interfered with each other's caprices. He travelled by the Paris express, and stayed at the Ritz just long enough to see the latest impropriety at the Palais Royal. And it happened curiously that Mrs. Bellenden was travelling by the same train, on the same day, stopping at the same hotel, attended by a young lady who would have been faultless as a dame de compagnie, except for a chronic neuralgia, which often compelled her to isolate herself in her hotel bedroom. Vera went along the lovely coast with Susie, who declared herself delighted to escape the monotony of the dinner wagon, and to see some of the most delicious spots in Italy with her dearest V, to which monosyllable friendship had reduced Vera's name. In an age that has substituted the telegraph and the telephone for the art of letter writing, it is well that names should be reduced to the minimum, and that our favourite politician should be Joe, our greatest general Bobbs, and our dearest friend M or N, rather than Margarita or Naomi. Vera showed Lady Susan all the things that were best worth seeing in Genoa and the neighbourhood, and they lingered at Portofino and other lovely nooks along that undulating coastline, garden villages dipping their edges into the blue water, and flushed with the pink glory of blossoming peach trees, raining light petals upon the young grass. It was the loveliest season of the Italian spring, and all along their way the world was glad with flowers. They missed nothing but the birds that were making grey old England glad before the flowers, but which here had been sacrificed to the young Italian's idea of sport. There was only one spot to which Vera went alone, and that was Mario Provana's grave. Happily, Susan had forgotten that he was buried at San Marco, and she wondered that Vera should have arranged to break the journey and stop a night at a place where there was absolutely nothing to see. Certainly it was not very far from Genoa, but a slow train and a headache made the journey seem an eternity to the impatient Susan, and when San Marco came she was very glad of her dinner and bed, and to have her hair taken down, after it had been hurting her all the way, and to no end, as she was utterly indifferent to the opinion of a couple of natives, the provincial Italian being no more to her than a red-skinned son of the Five Nations, or a New Zealander. Vera was able to spend an hour in the yew tree enclosure in the morning freshness between 6 and 7. She had telegraphed her order for 100 white roses to the San Marco florist the day before, and the flowers were ready for her in a light, spacious basket in the hall of the hotel when she came downstairs in the dim sunrise. "It is the last time," she said to herself, as she covered the great marble slab with her roses, and stooped to lay cold lips on the cold stone. "Giulia, Mario," she murmured tenderly, with lingering lips. "I am not afraid," she said to herself. "I know that he has forgiven me." Maid and footman and luggage went by the morning train, and half an hour after Vera and her friend left San Marco in a carriage that was to take them to Ventimiglia. By this means they had the drive in the morning sunshine, and escaped the long wait at the frontier, only entering the dismal station 5 minutes before their train left Italy. They spent that night in Marseilles, where Susan Amphlett insisted upon seeing the Canebière by lamplight, and they were in Paris on the following evening, and in London the next day. "And now you are going to begin a splendid season," said Susie, "in this dear old house. The rooms look mere pigeonholes after your Roman villa, but there is no place like London, and I really think Claude is right. The Villa Provana is much too big, and just a wee bit eerie. It suggests ghosts, if one does not see them. One of those sweet young Bersaglieri told me that your husband's father made a man fight a duel to the death with him in one of those weird upper rooms, and that the stamping of their feet and the rattle of their rapiers is heard at 2:15 on every 15th of November. When I heard the story I felt rather glad I did not come to you till December. Aren't you pleased to be home, Vera, in these cosy drawing rooms?" Everything in life is a question of contrast, and after the Villa Provana the drawing room in Portland Place, with its 5 long windows and perspective of other drawing rooms through a curtained archway, looked as snug as a suburban parlour. "Aren't you glad to be home?" persisted Susan. "No, Susie, I would rather have spent the rest of my life in Italy." "Oh, I suppose you prefer the climate. You are one of those people who care about the state of the sky. I don't. I like people, and shops, and theatres, and the opera at Covent Garden. Milan or Naples may be the proper place for music, but we get all the best singers. Don't think me ungrateful, Vera. I revelled in Rome, a place where one can go, from buying gloves and fans in the Corso to gloating over the circus where the Christian martyrs fought with lions, must be full of charm for anybody with a mind. Rome made a student of me. I read 2 historical primers and a novel of Marion Crawford's, besides dipping into Augustus Hare's delightful books. I haven't been so studious since I attended the Cambridge Extension lectures with my poor old governess, who used to amuse us by going to sleep and giving herself away by nodding. Her poor old bonnet used to waggle till it made even the lecturer laugh." Susie went off to join Mr. Amphlett in Northamptonshire, but she was to establish herself at the little house in Green Street directly after Easter, and then she and her dearest V must spend their lives together. Vera was not sorry to speed the parting guest. She had had rather too much of Susie in that month of Rome, for though she had lived her own life in a great measure, there was always the sense that Susie was there, and that she ought to give more of her time to her friend. She had suffered one grief in coming to London, for on landing at Dover she had to part with the Irish terrier, who was led off by a famous dog doctor's subordinate to spend 6 months in isolation, which was to be made as pleasant to him as such imprisonment could be made to an intelligent dog, warmly attached to a mistress who had raised him from the canine to the human by her companionship. Boroo was to pass 6 months in quarantine before he could stretch himself on the prayer rug at his mistress' feet and roll upon his back in an ecstasy of contentment. Boroo might be made comfortable in the retreat, as one of the favourites of fortune, but Boroo would not be happy without his mistress, and the first telephonic communication from the Canine Hotel informed Mrs. Rutherford that her faithful friend had refused food and was very restless. The functionary who gave this information assured her that this was only a passing phase in dog life, and that the terrier would be happier next day. And the account next day was comparatively cheerful. The terrier had eaten a little sheep's head and was livelier. Vera hated the law which deprived her of the only friend who had comforted her in hours of deepest dejection. The dog's welcome after every parting, the dog's abounding love, had given a new zest to life. Was there any other love left to her now quite as real as this? Her husband, her enthusiastic friend Susan, all the train of affectionate aunts and cousins, the girl cousins who came to her to relate their love affairs, the baby cousins who kissed her when their nurses told them, holding up cherry lips and smiling with sweet blue eyes, 3 generations of Disbrowes. Was there one among them all whose love she could believe in as she could in her Irish terrier? 6 months without Boroo. It was a dreary time to think of. Boroo was the only creature who could take her mind away from herself and her life's history. He had given her the beatitude of loving and being loved, without romance, without passion, without looking before or after, and realizing the difference this dumb creature made, she could but think with melancholy longing of what a child would have meant in her life. And now began the familiar round in the familiar house, with the Disbrowes gathering strong as of old to help and to suggest, to bring to Vera's parties the few great people who had not yet discovered that a Mrs. Rutherford whose wealth had come out of the city could be so particularly attractive, or could give parties that always had a touch of originality that made them worth one's while. These mighty ones told each other that it was the absence of conventionality that made Vera's house so agreeable, while Lady Susan, still playing her part of chorus, told the mighty ones that it was because her cousin was a poet's daughter and made an atmosphere of poetry round her. "Vera lives in a world of dreams," she said, "and we are all dreamers, though the horrid everyday world comes between us and our fairest visions. I think that's why we love her." A princess of the blood royal happened to meet Vera at this time, and became one of her most ardent admirers, lunching or dining in Portland Place at least once a week, and visiting Mrs. Rutherford in her opera box. She had heard of the Roman villa and the Roman parties. "I shall spend next January in Rome on purpose to see more of you," she said, upon which Claude, who was present, begged that Her Royal Highness would make the Villa Provana her home whenever she came to the Eternal City, an invitation which Her Royal Highness graciously promised to remember. "My sweet girl, you are on the crest of the wave," Lady Okehampton told her niece. "You were never so much the fashion as this year. You ought to be proud of your social success." "I wish I had my dog out of quarantine," was all Vera said. "Get another dog, Pekingese lion, ever so much smarter than your rough brute." The season wore through somehow in perpetual gaieties, which the wife hated, but which were essential to the husband's well-being. He had all the racing world, and never missed an important meeting; but when there was no racing he wanted dinner parties or crowded evenings, abroad or at home. Later there would be Cowes, where he had a new yacht just out of the builder's yard, waiting to beat every boat in the Channel. He did not often look at his wife's visiting list, being content to give her the names of the men who were to be asked to her dinners, taking it for granted that they would be asked. Every evening party was more or less an omnium gatherum, and about these he asked no questions. But more than once, between March and June, he had suggested that Mrs. Bellenden should be invited to dinner, to some smallish semi-literary and artistic dinner. And this suggestion being ignored, he had advised her being included in one of the big dinner parties where the mighty ones had been bidden to meet the royal princess. "I don't think that would do," Vera answered coldly. "You forget that Mrs. Bellenden is one of the handsomest women in London," Claude answered with some touch of temper, "and that people like to meet a well-known beauty." "I'm afraid Mrs. Bellenden is rather too well known. You had better give a dinner at Claridge's or the Ritz, Claude, and let Susan do hostess for you. Susie would enjoy it." "I suppose it will come to that," said Claude. "I'll take one of your Wagner nights when I know you'll be happy." Lady Susan, having warned her friend against the siren, was not so disloyal as to play hostess at a Bohemian dinner. "No, Claude," she said when the idea was mooted. "I've never been prudish, but I draw the line at Mrs. Bellenden." Her cousin shrugged his shoulders and left the room with a snatch of a French chanson, which was his most forcible expression of temper. The light tenor voice, the gay French verse, harmonized with the nature in which there were no depths. Goodwood was once more imminent, and Cowes was in the near future, when Vera sent out cards for her last evening party, which would be one of the last of the season, on the eve of the exodus of smart London. The Princess Hermione was to be at the party, and this royal lady was like that more famous heroine of the nursery who rode her white horse to Banbury Cross in a musical ride, for, like that famous lady, the Princess expected to have music wherever she went. Music, and of the best, for the royal Hermione was a connoisseur, and herself no mean performer on the violoncello. A famous baritone and an equally famous mezzo-soprano were to sing during the evening, in the inner drawing-room, not in a formal way with programmes and seats for people to be packed in rows, to sit there from start to finish till, in our elegant 20th century English, they were "fed up" with squalling. Everything was to be informal, and the people who did not want music would have space enough in the larger rooms and on the staircase to babble and to flirt as they chose, while that inner drawing-room would be, as it were, a sanctuary for the elect, a temple of the god of harmony. Vera stood at the door of the larger drawing-room receiving her guests, from 10 to past, when the Princess Hermione, who had just arrived, put her arm through her hostess's and asked eagerly, "Did you get him?" Signor Pergolesi, the baritone, understood. "Yes, ma'am. He is in the little drawing-room with Madame Rondolana, waiting to sing to you." "Take me there this moment, Vera." And hooked by the royal arm in a crumpled glove, Vera led the Princess and her lady-in-waiting through the babbling crowd to the sanctuary where the elect were beginning to bore each other while they waited for the first song. Herr Mainz was at the piano ready to accompany the two singers whose engagement he had negotiated. At all concerts of this clever gentleman's arranging, it seemed to some people as if the artists were puppets, and that he pulled the string that set them going all through the performance. To-night, however, there was to be less string-pulling and more sans façon, or rather it was Princess Hermione who was to pull the string. She certainly lost no time in telling Madame Rondolana what she wanted her to sing, and she kept that brilliant vocalist rolling out song after song in the rich abundance of a mezzo-soprano that nothing could tire. She sang song after song at the Princess's nod, Italian, German, Swedish, nay, even English, with an ease that testified to power without limit. The baritone looked and listened with languid interest, not offended, for he knew that his turn would come, and that when once the princess started him, she would never let him leave off. He sat near the piano in an easy attitude, not listening, but turning his thoughts inward, and making up his mind as to what songs he would sing. Wagner? Yes. Bizet? Yes, but in any case, Die beiden Grenadiers as a finish. And then those massive folding doors that were shutting out the babblers should be flung wide open, and he would sing to the whole of the company. He could stop their talking. Those two grenadiers were infallible. "With that song I always knock them in the old Kent Road," he used to tell his friends. At 11 o'clock there came a kind of subtle sense of something wanting, even beyond that exquisite music, and Lady Okehampton whispered to her niece that it was time the princess went to supper, and that Claude must take her downstairs. Vera went in search of him. The crowd in the biggest drawing-room had thinned, and she was able to look for her husband, but without success, and she went through the other rooms to the spacious landing, in which direction most people were drifting, and there she met a perturbed spirit in the form of Susan Amphlett. "What's the matter, Susie? Is there anything wrong?" "Wrong!" cried Susie. "I call it simply disgusting. How could you be such a fool?" "What have I done?" "To ask that horrid woman! And with your princess for the guest of the evening. She ain't prudish, but I fancy she'll think it a bit steep to find herself rubbing shoulders with Mrs. Bellenden." "I have not invited Mrs. Bellenden." "Some one else has, then. Well, she has come like the lady at Cannes, invitée ou non." "Is Mrs. Bellenden here?" "Yes, in the supper-room in a mob of admirers. Claude took her down to supper." "That's rather tiresome," Vera answered quietly, "for he ought to take the princess, and I can't keep her waiting. Do be kind, Susie, and go and tell him he must come to the music-room this minute. The princess ought to have gone down before anybody, and now you say there's a mob." "A perfect bear-garden of greedy beasts. I don't believe there'll be an ortolan left by the time she comes. Anyhow, I'll make it hot for Claude." And Susie hurried off, elbowing a desperate way through the crowd on the stairs. "Mon Dieu, quelle foire!" she muttered. Vera went back to the sanctuary, impounding her Uncle Okehampton on the way, in case she found the friendly Hermione indisposed to wait for her host. She found her princess with a dark and angry brow, standing near the door, whispering to her attendant lady. She had the look of a princess who had been almost waiting, and who did not like the sensation. She heard that Mr. Rutherford was making his way through the crowd to attend upon her, with an air of supreme indifference. "Lord Okehampton is one of my old friends," she said, and took his offered arm without looking at Vera. "Mr. Rutherford can bring Pauline," she said, as they moved away. Pauline was the lady in waiting, a colourless spinster of 37, who loved everything the princess loved, and hated everything she hated, and who dressed like the princess, only much worse. Lord Okehampton made himself vastly agreeable, and the mob, seeing the royal brow under the tiara, made way for the couple, and there was a table found for the royal lady in an agreeable position, and there were ortolans and peaches without stint. But when Claude came presently with the Honourable Pauline, he received a snub so unmistakable that he was glad to carry his honourable companion to the remotest corner of the room, where he gave her a sumptuous supper, and had the consolation of her sympathy. "The princess has a heart of gold," she told him, "but her temper is dreadful sometimes, and life is rather difficult with her." "Not quite a bed of roses," said Claude. "It would be ungrateful of me to call it a bed of stinging nettles," said Pauline, "because as there are 5 of us at home, all unmarried, I have to do something, and the Princess is wonderfully kind. And then she is so clever and accomplished. She does everything well, but music is her passion." "That's how I made my mistake," said Claude. "I thought her enjoyment of her own particular baritone would have lasted longer, and that I should have been in attendance before she was inclined to move." "The Princess has a good appetite," said Pauline, discussing her 4th ortolan, "and one really does get very hungry at an evening party. Music is so exhausting. I hope that dear Pergolesi and Madame Rondolana are having something." "Our good friend Mainz will take care of that." "Apropos," said Pauline, "there is a lady here I am rather curious about. We passed her on the stairs. Mrs. Bellenden, gloriously handsome and all that, but frankly, Mr. Rutherford, I was just a wee bit surprised to see her in your wife's house, especially to meet the Princess. I hardly like to speak of such things, but has she not been just a little talked about lately? Of course I know she went everywhere 2 years ago, but just lately people have said things, and one has not run against her at the best houses." "Of course she has been talked about," answered Claude, with his frank laugh. "Meteors are talked about. A woman so exceptionally beautiful is like Halley's comet. People are sure to talk about her, and the ill-natured talkers will make scandal about her. Poor Mrs. Bellenden! Quite a harmless person, I assure you. Open-hearted, generous, impulsive, a trifle imprudent perhaps, as these impulsive women always are." The lady-in-waiting had supped too well to be ill-natured. "I am so glad you have told me. I shall tell the Princess that there is no foundation for any of the stories we have heard about poor Mrs. Bellenden," she said, as they left the supper-room. The sanctuary was full of people when Lord Okehampton took the Princess back after a leisurely supper, during which they had talked over old friends and things that had happened a dozen years ago when Okehampton was master of the horse. The Princess had recovered her temper and was ready to enjoy her favourite Pergolesi, but Vera, who had not left the music-room, looked white and weary, and the kindly Hermione chid her for not having followed her to the supper-room. All the best people were now gathered in the inner drawing-room, some for the Princess and some for the baritone, and only the royal chair was vacant when the royal lady reappeared. Pergolesi chuckled at the thought that Rondolana had lavished her octave and a half of perfection on the chosen few, whilst he had all the finest tiaras and the largest display of shoulders and diamonds for his audience. Hermione beckoned him to her side, and they discussed what songs he should sing, she ordering, but he making her order what he wanted and had made up his mind about. "I should like to finish with Die beiden Grenadiers," he said in his broken English. "I think it is one of your favourites, madame?" "Je l'adore." Song after song was received with enthusiasm. Herr Mainz played a brilliant mazurka di salon, while the baritone rested and whispered with the Princess; and when the silvery chimes of an Italian 8-day clock announced midnight, the great doors were thrown open and Pergolesi hurled his splendid voice upon the crowd in the outer room. A phrase or two, and the babble of 300 voices had become silence. And when the song was done, the crowd melted away, still in comparative stillness, while Vera stood on the landing to see them pass, as if she were holding a review. No one wanted to begin talking after that stupendous song. People had stayed later than they intended, till it was too late to go on to other and perhaps better houses. The Princess had gone out by a second staircase, which had been kept clear for her, with Pergolesi and Okehampton to escort her downstairs, and Claude Rutherford to put her into her carriage. She went off in a charming mood, but could not refrain from a stab at the last. "Your wife's party has been perfect," she said, "but the company just a little mixed. I suspect you of having introduced the Bohemian element in the shape of that handsome lady whom everybody has been talking about." There were lingerers after that, and the party was not over till 1 o'clock. The last guest strolled into the pale grey night as Big Ben tolled the first hour of day. Claude followed his wife up the broad staircase, where the heated atmosphere was heavy with the scent of arum lilies and the daturas that hung their white bells in all the corners. She was moving slowly, tired and languid after the long evening, and she never looked back. He followed her to the door of her room, but she stopped upon the threshold, turned and faced him, ashy pale in her white gown, like a ghost. "Good-bye," she said, with a face of stone. "Vera, for God's sake, what's the matter?" "Good-bye," she repeated, and, as he moved towards her, she drew back suddenly, so quickly that he was unprepared for the movement, and shut the door in his face. He heard the key turning in the lock, shrugged his shoulders, and walked slowly along the gallery to his own room, not the room that had been Mario Provana's dressing room. "Some ass has been telling her things," he muttered to himself. And then he thought of Mrs. Bellenden's appearance that night, in a gown of gold tissue and a diamond tiara. She had been too insolently splendid in her overweening beauty, too tremendous, too suggestive of Cleopatra at Actium, a woman who lived upon the ruin of men. What wife, who cared for her husband, could help being angry if she saw him near such a creature? And he had been near her all the night. He had whispered with her in corners, hung over her perfumed shoulders, followed her close as her shadow, sat with her in a nest of tropical flowers in the balcony, instead of moving about among his guests. He had taken her down to the supper-room, first among the first, neglecting duchesses and a princess of the blood royal for her sake. No doubt that malicious little wretch Susan Amphlett had been watching him, and had reported all his misdoings to Vera. "What does it matter?" he said to himself. "My life was growing unbearable. The gloom was closing round me like a funeral pall. Kate was my only refuge. I have never been in love with her, but she stops me from thinking." That was the secret. Mrs. Bellenden had been his Nepenthe, when the common round of pleasures had lost their power to make him forget. Mrs. Bellenden was like strong drink, like opium or hashish. She killed thought. She filled the vacant spaces in his life, the Stygian swamps where black thoughts wandered in space like angry devils. Her exactions, her quarrels, their partings and reunions, the agitations and turmoil of her existence, had filled his life. When he banged the hall door of the bijou house in Brown Street behind him after one of their stormy farewells, he knew that he would go back to her in a week. He tramped the adjacent park, across and across, along and along, in a fury, and thanked God that he had done with "that harpy." But he knew that he would have to go back to the harpy, to be reconciled again, with oaths and kisses and tears, and to quarrel again, and to obey her orders, and go here or there as she made him. The most degrading slavery to a wicked woman was better than the great silent house and the horror that inhabited it. His wife had her consolations, nay, even her hysterical delights. She could shut herself in her white temple with the spirits of her worshipped dead. She heard voices. Death now hardly counted with her, neither death nor time. St. Francis of Assisi was as near her as Robert Browning. Shakespeare was no more remote than Henry Irving. She was mad. The emptiness, the silence, the gloom were killing him. If there had been children, all might have been different. The past would have been forgotten in those new and forward-looking lives. His sons and daughters would not have let him remember past things. And Vera would not have had time for morbid thoughts, for nursing dark memories. Her children would have made her forget. He had some kind of explanation with her on the day after the party, and made some feeble kind of apology. But she was cold and dumb. She expressed no anger, neither complained nor reproached him. She shed no tears. She stood before him in her white silence, still beautiful, but with a pale, unearthly beauty that chilled his heart. All the force of the old love swept back upon him, and his heart ached with a passion of pity and regret. He seized her by the shoulders, so frail, so wasted since last year, and looked at her with despairing eyes. "Vera, you are killing yourself by inches. What can I do? What can I do for you? Shall we go away, ever so far away? To new worlds, to places where the stupendous phenomena of nature, and the things that men have made, will take us out of ourselves. There are things in this world so tremendous that they can kill thought. The Zambesi, the Aztec cities of Mexico, the Great Wall of China." "You are very good," she answered, coldly but not unkindly, rather with a weary indifference, as of a soul too tired to feel or think. "I am quite contented here. My life in this house suits me as well as any life could." "In this house?" he cried. "Yes, in this house. I am not alone here. But I don't want to keep you here if the house makes you unhappy. You had better go away, Claude. Go anywhere you like, as you like. I shall not complain." "Are you giving me a letter of licence?" he asked, with a harsh laugh. "Is your love quite dead?" "Everything is dead," she answered. He could get no more from her, and he left her in anger. "You had better divorce me and marry Francis Symeon," he said, "and cultivate spookism together." The natural sequel to a scene like that was a little dinner at Claridge's with Mrs. Bellenden, and an evening at the silliest musical comedy to be seen and heard in London. His wife had given him a letter of licence. She had ceased to love him. He made himself so disagreeable to Mrs. Bellenden by dinner time that the meal was eaten in sullen silence, and the magnum of Veuve Pomeroy was hardly enough for two, for when Mrs. Bellenden was in a rage her glass had to be filled very often, and the waiters at the smart hotels knew her ways. The waiters worshipped her. "She tips as handsome as she tipples," had been said of her by one of them. Chapter 28